She left without a sound. No screaming, no thrown china, just empty rooms and a letter that might as well have been a death certificate for everything Rowan Hale thought he understood about control. The great lord of Blackridge Estate, unmovable, unshakable, stood in his wife's abandoned chamber holding a piece of paper, and for the first time in his disciplined life, he had absolutely no idea what to do. You're about to hear how a marriage died and clawed its way back from the grave. How a woman who couldn't get her husband to look at her finally made him see everything. How silence became louder than any argument ever could. This is a story about two people who had to destroy each other to find each other. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first time Lydia Vance walked through the iron gates of Blackridge Estate, she thought she'd entered a castle from a storybook. The second time, returning as Rowan Hale's wife, she realized it was more like a mausoleum. The estate sprawled across the highlands like something carved from the mountain itself. Gray stone, sharp angles, windows that looked less like openings to the world and more like defensive positions. Everything about it screamed fortification, not home. Rowan had been standing in the courtyard when the carriage arrived, straight-backed in his dark coat, hands clasped behind him, like a military officer awaiting inspection. 28 years old and already looked like he'd been alive for centuries. His face could have been handsome if it ever moved. Dark hair, darker eyes, the kind of features women might swoon over if they had any warmth behind them. Lydia stepped down from the carriage, her traveling dress wrinkled from the journey, trying to smile. He nodded. Once, like she was a delivery he'd been expecting. "Welcome to Blackridge," he said. Not welcome home, not "I'm glad you're here," just Blackridge. "Thank you," Lydia replied, forcing brightness into her voice. "It's even more impressive than I remembered." "Impressive?" Rowan repeated the word like he was testing it for structural integrity. "Yes, it served my family for 8 generations. You'll find it adequate." Adequate. Their marriage had been described the same way during negotiations. An adequate match, adequate lands, adequate dowry. She should have known then. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, a woman who looked like she'd been carved from the same stone as the estate, appeared to show Lydia to her rooms. Not their rooms, her rooms. Rowan had explained this in one of his 3 pre-wedding letters. He kept separate quarters to maintain proper rest for his duties managing the estate. Lydia's chambers were beautiful in the way a well-maintained tomb might be beautiful. High ceilings, dark wood furniture, tapestries depicting hunting scenes that made her vaguely uncomfortable. A massive 4-poster bed that could have slept 6 people, positioned in the center like an altar. "Will you need help unpacking, ma'am?" Mrs. Brennan asked. "No, Lydia looked around at the space that was supposed to be hers. "Actually, yes. That would be kind." Mrs. Brennan's expression didn't change. "Kind has nothing to do with it, ma'am. It's my job." "Right. Of course." That first dinner, Lydia had dressed carefully, hoping to make a good impression not just on Rowan, but on the handful of staff who'd be serving them. She'd chosen a deep blue gown her mother said brought out her eyes, arranged her blonde hair in a style that was fashionable but not too bold. She descended the stairs to find Rowan already seated at the head of an absurdly long dining table, reading what appeared to be ledgers. "Good evening," Lydia said, a little too loudly in the cavernous room. Rowan glanced up. "Evening." He gestured vaguely toward the opposite end of the table, approximately 15 feet away. "Please, sit." She did. A servant appeared immediately to pour wine. "How do you find your quarters?" Rowan asked, not looking up from his papers. "They're lovely, spacious." "Good." Silence, the kind that echoed. Lydia tried again. "The estate is remarkable. I'd love to learn more about its history. Perhaps you could show me around tomorrow." "Mrs. Brennan can provide a tour." He made a notation in his ledger. "I have meetings with the tenants." "Oh, I could accompany you? I'd like to meet—" "That won't be necessary. The tenants expect efficiency, not social calls." The first course arrived, some kind of soup. Lydia couldn't taste it. "I received a letter from my mother," she said, trying a different approach. "She sends her regards and hopes we're settling in well. Please convey my acknowledgement." Acknowledgement, not thanks, not warm wishes in return. She's invited us to visit next month. Just for a weekend. I thought it might be nice to... I can't spare the time. Rowan finally looked at her, and his expression was so perfectly neutral it was worse than a frown. Estate business is demanding. I'm sure you understand. What Lydia understood was that she was sitting 15 feet away from her husband, might as well have been 15 miles, and the distance had nothing to do with furniture arrangement. She tried. Lord, how she tried. In those first weeks, Lydia attempted every approach she could think of. She asked about his work, received one-word answers. She suggested activities they might do together, was told he had obligations. She even made the nearly fatal mistake of asking if he might dine in the small breakfast room instead of the formal dining hall. We have standards to maintain, Rowan said, as if she'd suggested eating with their hands. This estate has a reputation. I just thought something more intimate. Intimacy serves no practical purpose. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Their wedding night had been exactly what that sentence implied. Efficient, perfunctory. Rowan had entered her chambers at precisely 10 o'clock, performed his duty with the mechanical precision of someone checking off a task list, and departed by 1:30. Lydia had stared at the ceiling afterward, wondering if this was all marriage was supposed to be. 3 weeks later, when her monthly courses came, she'd felt an odd mixture of relief and shame. Relief because bringing a child into this ice palace felt cruel. Shame because she knew that producing an heir was part of her purpose here. Rowan received the news with a nod. These things take time. No disappointment in his voice, no reassurance, just statement of fact. The estate itself seemed designed to reinforce isolation. The servants moved like ghosts, appearing only when needed, vanishing the moment their tasks were complete. Mrs. Brennan ran the household with ruthless efficiency, but zero warmth. The groundskeeper, a grizzled man named Thorne, barely spoke at all. The library became Lydia's refuge. At least there, she could lose herself in other people's stories, other people's lives, other people's marriages that looked nothing like hers. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into her new life, she found a book of poetry tucked between heavy agricultural texts. The spine was cracked, pages worn. Someone had read this, actually read it, not just displayed it for show. She was so absorbed in a poem about springtime and renewal that she didn't hear Rowan enter. That belonged to my mother. Lydia jumped, nearly dropping the book. Rowan stood in the doorway, still as a statue. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to... It's fine. This is your home now. You may access the library as you wish. Your home. The words should have been welcoming. Instead, they sounded like he was granting her permission to exist in a space she'd already been occupying. Did your mother enjoy poetry? Lydia asked, hoping, desperately hoping, for an opening into something real. Rowan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She died when I was 12. I don't recall her preferences. I'm sorry, that must have been... It was a long time ago. He turned to leave, then paused. Dinner is at 7. Please don't be late. She'd been on time every single night. He knew that. The real cruelty of it all wasn't that Rowan was actively cruel. That almost would have been easier to understand, to fight against. Instead, he was simply absent. Present, but not there. Sharing a home, but not a life. Lydia began to notice things. Small things. The way Rowan's schedule never varied. Up at dawn, breakfast at precisely 7, estate business until noon, lunch, more business, dinner at 7, retreat to his study until 11. The way he stood with his hands clasped behind his back whenever he was uncertain. The way his left eye twitched, barely visible, but there, when Mrs. Brennan mentioned anything about his childhood. He wasn't a monster. That was almost worse. He was a man who'd built walls so high and thick that nothing could get through. Not even his own wife standing at the gate with her heart in her hands. 3 months in, Lydia decided to try something different. If he wouldn't engage with her directly, maybe she could reach him through action. She started small. Asked Mrs. Brennan about Rowan's favorite foods and made sure they appeared at dinner. He didn't comment, but she noticed he ate more of those meals. She learned his schedule and made sure she was in the morning room when he passed through, offering a genuine good morning each time. For 2 weeks, he merely nodded. On the 15th day, he said, morning, back. Progress, she told herself. Pathetic, microscopic progress, but progress nonetheless. She began taking walks around the estate grounds, learning the land he was so devoted to protecting, The rocky highlands stretched in all directions, wild and beautiful in their harshness. She could see why someone might love this place, might dedicate their life to it. One evening, she tried to share this with him. "I walked up to the North Ridge today," she said over dinner. "The view is extraordinary. You can see all the way to the McTavish Holdings." Rowan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You went to the North Ridge." "Yes, it's beautiful. That area isn't safe. The path is unstable, particularly after rain." "Oh, I didn't realize. In the future, inform Mrs. Brennan of your walking routes. Someone should know your location." For safety, he meant. Practical, logical safety. Not because he cared where she went or wanted to join her. Just risk management. "Of course," Lydia said quietly. That night, alone in her massive bed, she cried for the first time since arriving at Black Ridge. Not dramatic sobs, just silent tears that slid down her temples and into her hair as she stared at the ceiling. She'd entered this marriage with realistic expectations. She hadn't expected passionate love. That was for novels, not arranged marriages between landed families. But she'd hoped for something. Companionship. Partnership. Maybe eventually friendship. Instead, she had a contract, a very well-maintained, adequately executed contract. Winter came early to the highlands that year. By late October, frost covered the grounds each morning, and winds howled around the stone walls like they were trying to get in, or maybe trying to get out. Lydia had always loved autumn, the colors and harvest and preparation for cozy winter months. But there was nothing cozy about Black Ridge in winter. The fireplaces blazed but couldn't quite chase away the chill. The windows rattled. The hallways seemed to stretch longer in the dim light. And Rowan, if possible, became even more distant. "Estate business becomes more complex in winter," he explained one evening when Lydia asked if he might dine with her in the small breakfast room just once. "The tenants require more oversight. Resources must be carefully managed." "I understand that, but surely one evening, I can't afford distractions." Distractions. That's what she was. Not his wife, not his partner. A distraction from the real work of running Black Ridge. Lydia stopped asking after that. She began to retreat into herself, spending longer hours in the library, taking shorter walks as the weather worsened, eating meals mechanically while Rowan read his endless reports at the opposite end of the table. The servants noticed. She could see it in the way Mrs. Brennan's expression sometimes softened, just a fraction, when she brought Lydia's morning tea. In the way young Sarah, one of the maids, once asked if Lydia needed anything. "Anything at all, ma'am," with such emphasis that the subtext was clear. Someone cared that she was slowly disappearing. But caring didn't change anything. 5 months into the marriage, Lydia woke one morning and couldn't remember the last time Rowan had touched her. Not intimately. He still performed his scheduled conjugal visits with the same efficiency, but touched her, held her hand, brushed her shoulder in passing, any casual, affectionate contact that normal married people might share. She tested it that evening. When Rowan stood to leave the dinner table, she deliberately stepped into his path, close enough that he'd have to acknowledge her presence. "Excuse me," he said, stepping smoothly around her without breaking stride. She might as well have been furniture. That night, Lydia stood at her window, watching snow begin to fall over the dark highlands, and admitted something to herself. She was lonely. Desperately, crushingly lonely, in a way she'd never been, even as a single woman living in her family's bustling household. At least then, she'd had hope, had believed that marriage, even an arranged one, would bring some kind of connection. Now she had Rowan Hale, Lord of Black Ridge, master of his domain, and sovereign of absolutely nothing that mattered. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. Lydia had spent the morning helping Mrs. Brennan inventory the winter stores. Something to do, something to feel useful. They'd discovered several barrels of preserves had gone bad, needed replacing. At lunch, Lydia mentioned this to Rowan. "Mrs. Brennan said we'll need to purchase additional preserves from the village. I could accompany her tomorrow, help select. I'll send Thorne." "I don't mind going. Actually, I'd enjoy. Thorne knows the suppliers. He'll negotiate better prices." "It's not about prices, Rowan. I'd simply like to. The matter is settled." He returned to his meal. Something in Lydia snapped. Not explosively, quietly, like a thread pulled too tight for too long, finally giving way. "When did you last ask me what I'd like?" she said. Her voice was calm. eerily calm. Rowan looked up, confusion crossing his features. I beg your pardon? When did you last ask me what I want? What I enjoy? What matters to me? I ensure you have everything you require. Require? Yes. Like adequate shelter and adequate food and adequate clothing. Lydia set down her fork. Do you know what I wanted to do before I married you? Rowan stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. I wanted to study art. I was actually quite talented. My instructor said I had real potential. The words felt strange, saying them aloud after months of silence. My parents thought it frivolous, of course. Better to marry well, secure the family connections. But I loved it, creating something beautiful from nothing. Rowan seemed to search for words. Admirable. Is it? You don't sound convinced. Art is, I'm sure it's a pleasant hobby. A hobby? Lydia laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you have any hobbies, Rowan? Anything you do simply because it brings you joy? He frowned. Joy is, I have responsibilities. That's not an answer. My responsibility is this estate, my tenants, the legacy my family built over 8 generations. That's what matters. And I matter how, exactly. The question hung in the frigid air between them. Rowan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe. Or recognition. You're my wife, he said finally. Am I? Because most days I feel like just another piece of estate inventory. Present, accounted for, adequately maintained. That's not... Rowan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against stone. I have been nothing but proper to you. Proper? Yes. You've been tremendously proper. Lydia stood as well, surprising herself with her own boldness. You've given me everything except the one thing I actually need. Which is? You, Rowan. I need you to see me, to know me, to care that I exist beyond my function as your wife. For a moment, one brief, shining moment, Lydia thought she saw something crack in his armor. His jaw worked, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Then his face went smooth again, blank. The fortress of Black Ridge restored. I have estate business to attend to, he said. Please excuse me. He walked out. Lydia stood alone in the dining room, snow falling harder outside the windows, and realized something terrible. Nothing was going to change. Not tomorrow, not next month, not ever. This was her life now, this cold, empty, adequate existence, and she had no idea how much longer she could survive it. That night, she didn't cry. She just lay in her enormous bed, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling from the dying fire, and began to understand what it meant to feel yourself disappearing. The winter storm that had been building finally broke 3 days later. Wind screamed around Blackridge's walls. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see 10 feet beyond the windows. The entire estate battened down, preparing to wait it out. Rowan was in his element. Crisis management, resource allocation, ensuring the tenants were safe and supplied. This was where he excelled. Lydia watched him transform into something almost alive, moving through the halls with purpose, giving orders, solving problems. She didn't exist in this version of him either, but at least she could see who he might have been, in a different life, in a different marriage. On the storm's second night, a beam in one of the tenant cottages collapsed. Rowan rode out into the blizzard with Thorne to help, returning hours later, half frozen but satisfied they'd secured the building and moved the family to safety. Lydia had waited up, had actually been frightened for him when he didn't return at his usual hour. When he finally came through the door, she rushed forward. Thank heavens. I was so worried. Are you all right? You must be frozen. Let me call for hot water. I'm fine. Rowan peeled off his ice-crusted coat. The Mitchells are safe. That's what matters. Yes, but I've handled worse. Please don't fuss. Don't fuss. Don't worry. Don't care. Of course, Lydia said quietly. Forgive me for being concerned about my husband's well-being. Something in her tone made Rowan pause. He looked at her, really looked, maybe for the first time in weeks. Lydia, I didn't mean... It's fine. You're fine. Everything's adequately fine. She turned toward the stairs. Good night, Rowan. She left him standing in the entrance hall, melting snow pooling around his boots. The storm lasted 5 days. 5 days of howling wind and isolation, the estate truly cut off from the outside world. For some couples, it might have been romantic, forced proximity, shared crisis, opportunity to connect. For Rowan and Lydia, it just highlighted exactly how separate two people could be while trapped in the same building. On the 6th day, the storm broke. The sun emerged, harsh and bright against endless white. The snow was so deep it took 3 days just to clear paths to the main buildings. And Lydia made a decision. She didn't announce it, didn't discuss it with anyone. She simply began, quietly and carefully, to plan her escape. Not immediately. That would be foolish, possibly dangerous in winter. But when spring came, when the passes cleared and travel became possible again, she would leave. The thought should have terrified her. A woman leaving her marriage wasn't just scandalous, it was practically unheard of. Her family would be horrified. Society would shun her. She'd have no standing, no security, no future except what she could scrape together alone. But as Lydia sat in her window seat watching snow slowly melt from the barren highlands, she realized something. She was already alone. Already had no real standing in this marriage. Already had no future except more of the same crushing emptiness. At least if she left, she'd be alone on her own terms. The decision, once made, changed something in her. She stopped trying so hard, stopped hoping for breakthroughs that would never come. Stopped performing the role of devoted wife for an audience of one who never watched the show. She became quieter, not sullen or rebellious, just present in a different way, going through the motions with the same efficiency Rowan brought to everything. If he noticed the change, he didn't mention it. February dragged into March. The snow began to recede. Ice on the paths turned to mud. The first hardy birds returned, their calls echoing across the awakening highlands. Lydia began taking inventory of what she'd need. Money. She'd been carefully saving the small household allowance Rowan provided, tucking away coins here and there. Clothing, practical traveling clothes, nothing that would draw attention. A destination. She had cousins in the South who might take her in, at least initially. And a letter. She'd need to leave a letter. That was the part she kept putting off. What do you say to a husband you're abandoning? How do you explain that you're not leaving because he was cruel, but because his indifference was killing you more slowly and painfully than cruelty ever could? Spring arrived properly in April. The highlands transformed from brown and gray to tentative green. Flowers appeared in sheltered spots. The world came back to life, except inside Blackridge, where nothing ever really changed. Lydia chose a date, April 28th. The coaching road would be fully passable by then. She'd booked passage to the south under a false name, paid in advance with her carefully hoarded coins. 1 week before her planned departure, Rowan did something unexpected. He asked her to accompany him on estate rounds. "The tenants have requested to meet you properly," he said over breakfast, as casually as if he'd been including her in such things all along. "I thought it might be appropriate, if you're amenable." Lydia stared at him, coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. "You want me to come with you?" "If you wish." Was that actual uncertainty in his voice? "I should have included you in such matters before. It was an oversight. An oversight. 8 months of marriage, and her exclusion from every meaningful aspect of his life was an oversight." "I see," Lydia said carefully. "And what prompted this correction?" Rowan's jaw tightened. Mrs. Brennan suggested it might be appropriate. As Lady of Blackridge, the tenants expect to know you. Of course. Not because he wanted her company, because it was appropriate, because the tenants expected it. "Then by all means," Lydia said, "let's be appropriate." They rode out the next morning, Rowan on his massive gray gelding, Lydia on a smaller chestnut mare. The spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of new grass and thawing earth. Under different circumstances, it might have been pleasant. Rowan was different with the tenants. Not warm exactly, but engaged. He listened to their concerns, made decisions on resource allocation, discussed planting strategies with an ease Lydia had never seen in him. "Your husband knows this land better than anyone," old Mr. Brennan, the housekeeper's uncle apparently, told Lydia while Rowan inspected a damaged irrigation channel. "Been working it since he was a boy. After his father passed, he kept everything running when he weren't barely 16. These holdings would have fallen apart in lesser hands." "He seems very dedicated," Lydia offered. "Aye. Too dedicated, some might say. The lad doesn't know how to exist except in service to this place. Mr. Brennan gave her a knowing look. Probably makes him difficult to live with. Lydia wasn't sure what shocked her more, the observation or the fact that someone had actually noticed. He's very proper, she said carefully. Proper. The old man chuckled. That's one word for it. Scared might be another. Scared. Lord Hale? Of course scared. Boy watched his father work himself to death for this place. Watched his mother waste away from loneliness after. That'll make anyone afraid of caring too much. He patted her hand. Give him time, lass. There's a good man under all that stone, just buried deep. They rode back to Blackridge in silence. Lydia watched Rowan straight back, his hands steady on the reins, his eyes scanning his domain with the vigilance of a general surveying a battlefield. Scared. Was that possible? Could this fortress of a man actually be afraid? And even if he was, did it matter? Fear might explain his behavior, but it didn't change it. Didn't make 8 months of isolation hurt any less. Didn't give Lydia back the version of herself that had walked through Blackridge's gates with hope still intact. She had 5 days left. That night, she finally started writing the letter. It took her 4 attempts to find the right words. Not accusatory. What was the point of accusations? Not pleading. Her pride wouldn't allow it. Just honest. Rowan, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not because you've been cruel. You haven't. Not because you've failed in your duties as my husband. By every measurable standard, you've fulfilled them adequately. I'm leaving because I can't spend the rest of my life being adequate. Can't keep trying to reach someone who's determined to remain unreachable. Can't keep disappearing a little more each day in a place where I was never truly seen. I don't expect you to understand. I'm not sure I entirely understand myself. I only know that staying here is killing something essential in me, and if I don't leave now, I'm afraid there won't be enough left of me to save. You'll be fine without me. Better, probably. Free to devote yourself fully to Blackridge without the distraction of a wife who wanted more than you were able to give. I'm sorry I couldn't be what you needed. I'm sorry you couldn't be what I needed. I'm just sorry. Lydia. She folded the letter and placed it in her escritoire, planning to leave it on her pillow the morning she departed. 3 days before her planned escape, disaster struck. Lydia woke to shouting, ran to her window to see flames, massive, angry flames, consuming one of the main barns. Rowan was already in the courtyard, organizing a bucket line, his voice cutting through the chaos with commands. Without thinking, Lydia threw on a robe and ran outside. Go back inside, Rowan shouted when he saw her. It's not safe. I can help. Lydia, I don't have time to... Then don't argue with me. She grabbed a bucket, joined the line, worked alongside servants and tenants for hours as they fought the blaze. By the time they finally got it under control, dawn was breaking and Lydia was covered in soot, her hands blistered, her body aching. Rowan found her sitting on the stone wall, staring at the smoking ruins. You should have stayed inside, he said quietly. Probably. You could have been hurt. So could you. He sat beside her, actually sat, their shoulders nearly touching. Close enough that Lydia could smell smoke and sweat and the particular scent that was just him. Thank you, he said, for helping. It's my home too, or it's supposed to be. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, rougher. I'm not good at this. Good at what? Being a husband, being connected. To anything except this place. He gestured at the estate. My father taught me that emotion was weakness, that discipline was everything, that a man controls his world by controlling himself. And how's that working for you? The question came out sharper than she intended, but Rowan didn't flinch. Not well, he admitted, but it's all I know how to be. Lydia looked at this man, her husband, this stranger, and felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not even hope, really. Just recognition. He was trapped too, in his own way, imprisoned by expectations and fear and a childhood that had taught him love was dangerous. Understanding him didn't mean she had to stay. Rowan, she said softly, knowing why you're drowning doesn't make the water any less deep. He turned to look at her, confusion and something else, maybe the beginning of real fear, in his eyes. But before he could respond, Thorne called out about a structural concern in one of the remaining outbuildings, and the moment shattered. Rowan stood, returned to being Lord of Black Ridge, crisis manager, the man who had everything under control except the one thing that actually mattered. 2 days left. Lydia finished her preparations, packed a small trunk, made arrangements for the stable boy to have a horse ready before dawn, finalized her letter. On the morning of April 28th, she woke at 4, dressed in her traveling clothes, took one last look at the enormous bed she'd spent so many lonely nights in, left the letter on her pillow, walked through the silent halls of Black Ridge Estate for the last time, and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness while her husband slept, surrounded by 8 generations of stone and duty and everything that mattered more than she ever had. The fortress stood, silent, impenetrable. Inside it, Rowan Hale had no idea his entire world was about to crack open. Rowan didn't discover the letter until almost noon. He'd been up since before dawn dealing with the barn fire's aftermath, assessing damage, reassigning storage space, coordinating repairs. The kind of crisis management that made him feel competent, useful, in control. It wasn't until Mrs. Brennan found him in the courtyard, her face oddly pale, that anything registered as wrong. "My lord," she said, her voice tight, "you should come inside. I'm occupied. Whatever it is can— Now, sir. Please." Something in her tone made him follow. She led him not to his study or the morning room, but up the stairs, to Lydia's chambers. The door stood open. Inside, everything looked normal. Bed made, curtains drawn. Except, "Her trunk is gone," Mrs. Brennan said quietly. Most of her practical clothing, the traveling cloak she arrived in. Rowan stood frozen in the doorway. "Perhaps she's visiting, without informing anyone, without taking a carriage or proper escort?" Mrs. Brennan crossed to the bed, picked up a folded piece of paper from the pillow. "She left this." The world tilted. Rowan took the letter with hands that didn't feel attached to his body, unfolded it, read words that made absolutely no sense because they couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Lydia couldn't have— "By the time you read this, I'll be gone." He read it 3 times, then a 4th. Like repetition would somehow change the meaning. "How long?" His voice sounded strange, distant. "I saw her at breakfast yesterday. Haven't seen her since." Mrs. Brennan hesitated. "The stable boy mentioned a horse went missing early this morning, before dawn. 12 hours. Maybe more. She could be anywhere." "Which direction?" "He didn't see. Just noticed the mare was gone when he came on duty at 6. Rowan looked down at the letter again. "I'm leaving because I can't spend the rest of my life being adequate." Adequate. He'd called their marriage adequate, had thought he was paying a compliment, stating a fact, professional assessment of a functional arrangement, and she'd heard, "You don't matter." "Sir?" Mrs. Brennan's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What would you like me to do?" What did one do when one's wife vanished? Was there a protocol for this in the estate management manuals? A procedure to follow? Rowan's mind, usually so sharp and organized, felt like it was moving through mud. "I need to think. Perhaps you should contact her family or—" "No." The word came out sharper than intended. "Not yet. Give me a moment." Mrs. Brennan left quietly, closing the door behind her. Rowan stood alone in his wife's abandoned bedroom, holding a letter that might as well have been a mirror, showing him exactly what he'd become. "You'll be fine without me." Better, probably. Would he? Would anything about this be fine? He sat on the edge of Lydia's bed, the bed he'd visited precisely 14 times in 8 months, always at the scheduled hour, always with the same efficient detachment, and tried to remember the last time he'd actually looked at her. Not glanced at, not observed in passing, actually looked. The image that came to mind was from 2 nights ago, after the fire. She'd been covered in soot, her blonde hair falling out of its pins, hands blistered from bucket handles. And she'd looked alive. More alive than he'd ever seen her in all their months of adequate marriage. When had that changed? When had the bright-eyed woman who'd arrived at Black Ridge transformed into the quiet ghost who moved through his periphery? He knew the answer. He just hadn't wanted to see it. Rowan stood, letter still clutched in his hand, and walked to his study. Sat at his desk, looked at the carefully organized ledgers, the reports on crop rotation and tenant disputes and resource allocation. 8 generations of Hale legacy, all documented, all maintained. All completely meaningless if he'd destroyed the one thing that might have made it worth something. His father's voice echoed in his head. Emotion is weakness, Rowan. A man who rules his estate must first rule himself. Control everything, and you control your fate. Jonathan Hale had died at 46, slumped over these same ledgers, heart giving out from years of rigid control. His mother had lasted 3 more years before pneumonia took her, though Rowan suspected it was really loneliness that killed her. He'd been 12, watching her fade like morning mist, and he'd promised himself he'd never be weak like that. Never let caring destroy him. So he'd built walls, high ones, strong ones, and now he was 38 years old, sitting alone in a fortress, master of everything except the one thing that mattered. The door opened without knocking. Thorne stood there, his weathered face unreadable. "Heard about the lady," he said simply. "News travels fast. Always does in a place like this." Thorne moved further into the room uninvited, something he'd never done before. "You going after her?" "I don't—" Rowan set down the letter. "What would be the point? She made her choice clear." "Did she? Or did she just choose to stop drowning?" The words hit like a physical blow. "You don't understand. I understand you've been doing to that girl exactly what your father did to your mother." Thorne's voice was harsh. "Watching you two this past year has been like watching history repeat itself, and I swore I wouldn't stand by silent this time. My father ran this estate successfully for 30 years, and died alone and miserable with a wife who wept herself to sleep most nights. That the legacy you want?" Rowan's hands clenched. "You overstep." "Aye, probably, but somebody needs to." Thorne crossed his arms. "I watched you grow up, boy. Saw a bright lad with his mother's kindness turn himself into stone because he was terrified of ending up like her. But you know what? She wasn't weak. She was brave enough to keep loving a man who couldn't love her back. That takes more strength than all your control ever will. Get out. When I've said my piece." Thorne's eyes were steady. "You've got maybe a day's head start to find her before she's too far gone. After that, she's lost to you for good. So you need to decide right now. Are you going to be your father, sitting in this study managing an estate that means nothing without someone to share it with? Or are you going to be the man your mother hoped you'd become?" "I don't know how to be that man." The words tore out of him, raw and desperate. Rowan stood abruptly, chair scraping against stone. "I don't know how to be anything except this. I've spent my entire life learning to control, to manage, to keep everything running. How do I just stop? How do I become something I've never been?" "You start," Thorne said quietly, "by getting on a horse and riding after your wife." The simplicity of it was almost laughable, as if finding Lydia would fix everything, as if one grand gesture could undo 8 months of calculated indifference. But the alternative was sitting here, letting her vanish, proving her letter exactly right, that he'd be fine without her, that the estate mattered more, that nothing would really change. Rowan looked down at the ledgers on his desk. 8 generations of Hale history. His father's life work. His grandfather's before that. All the way back to the first Lord of Blackridge who'd carved this holding out of harsh Highland stone. What had any of it been for? What did it mean if it just produced an endless line of lonely men dying alone in this study? "If I go," Rowan said slowly, "the spring planting, I've been managing this land since before you were born. I think I can handle a few weeks without you. The tenants will need, but the tenants will be fine. What they don't need is watching another Hale man choose duty over the person right in front of him." Rowan's throat felt tight. "What if I can't find her?" "Then at least you tried. That's more than your father ever did." The truth of it settled like stones in his chest. His father had let his mother waste away, had told himself it was for the good of the estate, had died never admitting that some things mattered more than land and legacy. Rowan had spent his whole life determined not to become his father. He'd become him anyway. "I don't even know where she went," he said, hearing the defeat in his own voice. Thorne pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Stable boy said he saw her head south on the coaching road. I asked around the village this morning. Young woman matching her description bought passage on the southbound coach yesterday, paid extra to get off at Millbrook." "Millbrook? Why would she—" Then Rowan remembered. Lydia had mentioned cousins once, in passing. He hadn't been paying attention. He never paid attention to the things that mattered. How far is Millbrook from here? 2 days hard riding, 3 if you're being cautious about the terrain. 2 days. She already had 12 hours on him. Every moment he stood here debating was another moment she got further away. Rowan looked at Thorne, this gruff old man who'd worked Blackridge land for 40 years, who'd watched 3 generations of Hales make the same mistakes. If I leave now... You won't be leaving. You'll be fighting for something worth more than all this stone. Thorne gestured at the study walls. That's not abandonment, boy. That's finally getting your priorities straight. Something in Rowan's chest cracked. Not broke. Cracked. Like ice beginning to thaw. I don't know what to say to her. Start with the truth. That's more than you've given her so far. 20 minutes later, Rowan was mounted on Storm, his gray gelding, wearing traveling clothes and carrying supplies for 3 days. Mrs. Brennan had appeared with food and a bedroll, her eyes suspiciously bright. Bring her home, sir, she said quietly, or don't come back yourself. It wasn't a suggestion. Rowan rode south as the sun climbed higher, pushing Storm harder than was probably wise. The coaching road was muddy from spring rains, treacherous in places, but he didn't slow down. 2 days to Millbrook. 2 days to figure out what he was going to say to a woman who'd been driven to escape her own marriage because her husband couldn't see past his own carefully constructed walls. The first night, he camped in a grove off the main road, too restless to sleep. He kept reading Lydia's letter by firelight, each word cutting deeper. I'm leaving because I can't spend the rest of my life being adequate. How many times had he used that word? How many times had he thought he was being professional, measured, appropriate, when really he was just keeping her at arm's length because caring was dangerous? His mother had cared, had loved his father with everything she had, and it had killed her slowly, loving someone who couldn't love her back. Rowan had watched it happen and sworn he'd never be that vulnerable. Instead, he'd become the person doing the killing. He rode into Millbrook late on the second day, exhausted and filthy. It was a small market town, prosperous enough, with a proper inn and several shops clustered around a central square. Rowan stabled Storm and headed for the inn. The keeper, a round woman with sharp eyes, looked him over with obvious suspicion. Need a room, Rowan said. Got one left. Upstairs, end of hall, 3 shillings. He paid. Started to turn away, then stopped. I'm looking for someone. A young woman, blonde, would have arrived 2 days ago. Traveling alone. The keeper's expression went carefully neutral. Might have seen someone like that. Might not have. Depends on who's asking. I'm her husband. Huh. The woman crossed her arms. And does this husband have a name? Rowan Hale, Lord of Blackridge Estate. Something flickered in her eyes. Blackridge? That's up north, isn't it? Yes. Please, if you've seen her. Saw a young lady matching that description. Came through on the coach, stayed one night, left yesterday morning. Rowan's stomach dropped. Left? Where? Didn't say. Paid her bill, thanked me kindly, and walked off toward the south road. The keeper studied him. She seemed sad, but determined, like a person who'd made a hard choice and was sticking to it. Did she mention where she was going? Any family? Any destination? We don't pry into guests' business here. It was a lie. Small-town innkeepers knew everything, but this woman had clearly decided Lydia deserved protection. Please, Rowan said, and the word felt foreign in his mouth. I know I have no right to ask. I know whatever drove her away was my fault, but I need to find her. I need to try. The keeper's expression softened slightly. Try what exactly? To be better than I was. To be the husband she deserved instead of the one she got. A long silence. Then, she mentioned something about Ashford. Has cousins there, she said. The Merchants. Ashford. Another 2 days south. Thank you, Rowan said quietly. Don't thank me. Just don't make that girl regret existing. She's too kind for that. The words stung because they were true. Lydia was kind, bright and hopeful and willing to try. And he'd systematically crushed every attempt she'd made to reach him. Rowan didn't sleep that night either, just lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at unfamiliar walls, wondering what the hell he was going to say when, if, he found her. I'm sorry seemed painfully inadequate. I was wrong, was obvious. Please come back was exactly what she'd been trying to escape. What did you say to someone you'd broken through absence? Through choosing duty over connection, control over vulnerability, the safety of walls over the risk of caring. Dawn came too slowly and too fast. Rowan was back on the road before full light, pushing south toward Ashford. The countryside changed as he traveled. The harsh highlands gave way to gentler hills, then to rolling farmland. Spring was more advanced here, trees in full leaf, fields green with new growth, wildflowers blooming along the roadside. It was beautiful in a way Blackridge never was. Softer, warmer, the kind of place someone might escape to if they were tired of living in a fortress. He reached Ashford on the 4th day after leaving Blackridge. It was larger than Millbrook, prosperous looking, with neat houses and well-maintained streets. The kind of town where a woman could disappear, start over, build a life that had nothing to do with cold stone estates and colder husbands. Finding the Merchant family took less than an hour. They lived in a comfortable house on the edge of town, with gardens and a small orchard. Rowan stood at the gate for a long moment, suddenly paralyzed. What if she refused to see him? What if she took one look and told him to leave? What if... The front door opened. A woman emerged, maybe 40, with Lydia's coloring and similar features. She spotted Rowan immediately, and her expression went cold. "If you're who I think you are," she said, "you have about 10 seconds to state your business before I set the dogs on you." Definitely Lydia's cousin. "My name is Rowan Hale. I'm looking for—" "I know who you are. Lydia's told me all about you." The woman, Catherine Merchant, he assumed, crossed her arms. "Told me about the marriage that wasn't a marriage. The husband who treated her like furniture. The 8 months she spent trying to matter to someone who couldn't be bothered to see her." Each word landed like a blow, accurate, devastating. "I was wrong," Rowan said, "about all of it. I need to speak with her." "She doesn't want to speak with you." "Did she say that? Or are you deciding for her?" Catherine's eyes narrowed. "She said she needed time, space, a chance to remember who she was before she married you." "I understand, but I've ridden 4 days to get here. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for 5 minutes of her time." "Why? So you can convince her to come back to that prison you call a home?" "No." The word came out harder than intended. Rowan forced himself to breathe. "So I can tell her the truth, that she was right, that I was exactly the man she described in her letter, and that I'm trying—" His voice cracked. "I'm trying to figure out how to be different." Catherine studied him for a long moment. Then, without warning, she called back toward the house. "Lydia, you have a visitor!" Rowan's heart stopped. Footsteps. The door opening wider. And then, Lydia stood in the doorway, wearing a simple blue dress he'd never seen before, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked different. Not broken, not faded. Actually, present. Like someone had turned a light back on inside her. When she saw him, she went very still. Rowan. Just his name. No emotion he could identify in it. "Lydia, may I speak with you?" She looked at Catherine, who shrugged. "Your choice, dear." Lydia was quiet for several heartbeats. Then, 5 minutes. In the garden. She led him around the side of the house to a small garden, blooming with early roses. They stood facing each other across a stone bench, and Rowan felt like he was standing before a judge awaiting sentence. "You look well," he said, then immediately wanted to kick himself. 4 days of riding, and that's what he opened with? "I am well?" Lydia's voice was calm, steady. "Catherine and her husband have been very kind." "I'm glad. You deserve kindness." "Yes, I do." She met his eyes directly. "What are you doing here, Rowan?" I wanted to." He stopped, started again. "I read your letter, multiple times, and I realized you were right about everything. I was adequate. I gave you adequate shelter and adequate food and adequate nothing that mattered. I know. I lived it." The flatness in her tone hurt worse than anger would have. "I don't have an excuse," Rowan continued. "My father was cold, yes. My mother's death shaped me, yes. But those are reasons, not excuses. I chose to build walls. I chose to keep you out. I chose duty over you. Lydia looked away toward the roses. Why did you come all this way to tell me things I already know? Because I'm hoping. Rowan's voice broke. He cleared his throat, tried again. Because I'm hoping you'll let me try to be better. Not for the estate, not for propriety or legacy or any of the things I've used as excuses. For you. Because you matter. Because somewhere in the last 4 days of riding, I realized that every single thing I've built means nothing if I lost you to build it. You didn't lose me, Rowan. You never had me to lose. The truth of it was crushing. I know, and I can't change the past 8 months. Can't undo the damage. But if you'll give me a chance to what? To try for a few weeks before defaulting back to who you really are? Lydia finally looked at him, and her eyes were dry. That was worse than tears. I don't want promises, Rowan. I've had promises. I want actual change, and I don't think you're capable of it. Maybe I'm not, Rowan admitted. Maybe I'll try and fail. Maybe I'm too damaged, too rigid, too much my father's son. But I'm asking, begging, for the opportunity to find out. By what? Coming back to Blackridge? Resuming our adequate marriage? No, by letting me court you. Lydia blinked. What? I never courted you. We went straight from introduction to wedding. You never got to choose me. You got assigned to me. Rowan took a step closer. So let me court you properly. Let me earn the right to call you my wife instead of just assuming the title grants me access to you. Rowan, that's insane? Probably. Unconventional? Definitely. But I'm standing here 4 days from home, covered in road dust, begging a woman to give me a chance I don't deserve. I think we're past conventional. A flicker of something crossed Lydia's face. Surprise, maybe. Or the ghost of amusement. And if I say no, then I go back to Blackridge. Sign whatever papers you need for a separation. Make sure you're provided for financially. And spend the rest of my life knowing I had something precious and destroyed it through sheer stupidity. Lydia was quiet for a long time. In the silence, Rowan could hear birds singing, wind moving through the rose bushes, the distant sound of town life. Finally, she said, "What would this courting look like?" Hope flared in his chest. Fragile, terrifying. I don't know. I've never done it before. Letters, maybe. Visits. Whatever you're comfortable with. At your pace. On your terms. Not at Blackridge. No, here. Or wherever you want to be. And you'd go back? Manage the estate while writing me letters like some lovesick boy? Yes. Rowan. Lydia shook her head slowly. That estate is your whole life. You can't just... It was my whole life because I was too afraid to have anything else. But I've spent 4 days writing, and you know what I thought about? Not crop rotation, not tenant disputes. You. I thought about the way you tried to share your art with me, and I called it a hobby. The way you wanted to meet the tenants, and I told you it wasn't necessary. Every single moment I chose the estate over you. He moved closer, not touching, just close enough that she could see his face clearly. I don't know if I can change, Lydia. I don't know if I can become the man you need, but I know that losing you was the first time in my adult life I felt actual fear. Not the fear of failure or loss of control, fear that I'd destroyed the only real thing I'd ever had. Lydia's composure cracked slightly. He saw it in the way her hands clenched, the slight tremor in her jaw. You hurt me, she said quietly. Every single day you hurt me. Not with cruelty, with absence. Do you have any idea what it's like to be invisible to the one person who's supposed to see you? No, but I'd like to understand, if you'll teach me. Why should I? Why should I take that risk when you've already proven what you are? Because maybe... Rowan's throat was tight. Maybe I'm not just what I was raised to be. Maybe there's something salvageable underneath all the control and fear. And maybe you're the only person who ever bothered to look for it. Lydia turned away from him, arms wrapped around herself. For a terrible moment, Rowan thought she was going to tell him to leave. Then she said very quietly, 1 letter a week. That's all I'm offering. You write, I'll read. If I want to respond, I will. If I don't, you accept that. Yes, anything. And you stay at Blackridge, run your estate, live your life. Don't come here again unless I explicitly invite you. Understood. And Rowan? She turned to face him, and her expression was harder than he'd ever seen it. If you write me duty and obligation and adequate anything, I'll burn every letter without reading it. I want the truth, the real you, whoever that is. Not Lord of Blackridge, just you. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Lydia studied him for another long moment, then, "Your 5 minutes are up." It was dismissal, but it wasn't rejection. Rowan bowed, actually bowed, something he hadn't done since he was a boy. "Thank you for listening, for the chance." He turned to leave, made it 3 steps before Lydia's voice stopped him. "Rowan?" He looked back. "That thing you said about being afraid." She hesitated. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me in our entire marriage." "I know. I'm sorry it took this long." "Don't apologize. Just do better." "I will, or I'll die trying." "Don't die. Just be real." He left her standing in the rose garden, backlit by afternoon sun, looking more alive than she ever had at Blackridge. The image burned itself into his mind. This is what she looked like when she wasn't drowning. This is who she could be when she wasn't being crushed by his indifference. This is what he'd almost lost forever. Catherine Merchant was waiting by the front gate, arms still crossed. "She gave me a chance," Rowan said. "1 letter a week. Then you better make them count. Because that girl has already survived you once. She won't do it again." "I know." "Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're a man who spent his whole life choosing wrong. 1 week of good intentions won't fix that." "You're right, but maybe 100 weeks will, or 1,000. Rowan met her eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for time to earn it." Catherine's expression softened fractionally. "She deserves better than you gave her. She deserves better than me, period. But I'm hoping to become someone worthy of her anyway." He rode out of Ashford as the sun set, heading back toward Blackridge. 4 days of hard riding ahead. 4 days to figure out what to say in a letter that would be honest without being pathetic, real without being self-indulgent, true without being a burden. 4 days to figure out how to become someone other than the man he'd always been. The first night, camped under stars he'd never bothered to notice before, Rowan pulled out paper and tried to write. Crossed out 6 attempts. Finally wrote, "Lydia, I don't know how to do this, but I'm going to try." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't eloquent. It was just true. And maybe for the first time in his life, truth was enough to start with. He mailed the letter from the first town he passed through on the way back. The return journey felt different, longer. Every mile toward Blackridge felt like moving backward instead of forward, returning to a place that had become a monument to everything he'd done wrong. Rowan arrived home 6 days after he'd left to find the estate running smoothly without him. Thorne had managed the spring planting. Mrs. Brennan had kept the household functioning. The tenants hadn't burned the place down in his absence. Turned out Blackridge didn't actually need him as desperately as he'd always told himself. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, it was oddly freeing. "She all right?" Thorne asked when Rowan found him inspecting the new grain stores. "Alive, safe, wants nothing to do with me except weekly letters." "That's more than you deserved." "I know." Thorne studied him with those sharp old eyes. "You look different." "I feel like I've been turned inside out and put back together wrong." "Good. Maybe wrong is what you needed to be all along." Rowan spent that first week back trying to figure out what to write in his next letter. The estate demanded attention. There were always reports to review, decisions to make, problems to solve. But every time he sat at his desk, he found himself staring at blank paper instead of ledgers. What did you say to someone you'd broken? How did you prove you were changing when you weren't sure you even knew how? He started small. Observational. "Lydia, the estate feels different since I returned. Or maybe I'm the one who's different, and everything else is exactly as it always was. I noticed something today. There's a painting in the morning room, your favorite room, I think, though I only know that because you used to sit there with your tea in the early light. It's a landscape, hills and sky. The kind of thing I've walked past 1,000 times without really seeing. Today I looked at it. Actually looked. Tried to understand why someone would spend time capturing that particular moment, that specific quality of light. I don't know if I succeeded, but I tried. You said you wanted to study art once. I'm sorry I called it a hobby. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but that one stays with me. You offered me a piece of who you were, and I dismissed it like it was nothing. I'm trying to see differently now. I don't know if I'm any good at it yet. Rowan. He mailed it before he could second-guess himself. 2 weeks passed. No response. Rowan told himself that was fine. She'd said she might not respond. He'd agreed to those terms. But every day that passed without a letter felt like confirmation that he'd already failed, that whatever chance she'd given him was slipping away. He wrote anyway. Lydia, Mrs. Brennan told me today that you used to help with the household accounts when I was occupied with estate business. I never knew that. Or I knew and didn't register it as important, which might be worse. She said you had suggestions for reorganizing the storage systems that saved us considerable waste, that you noticed inefficiencies I'd overlooked for years. I thought I was the only one keeping this place running. Turns out, I was just the only one taking credit for it. There's a metaphor there about our marriage, I think, about how blind I was to everything you contributed, everything you tried to be. I'm seeing it now. Too late to matter, maybe, but I'm seeing it. R. Still no response. He kept writing. Once a week, like she'd demanded. Sometimes longer letters, sometimes shorter. Never about obligation or duty, just observations. Thoughts. The kind of honest vulnerability he'd spent his entire life avoiding. Lydia. I had dinner in the breakfast room tonight instead of the formal dining hall. Mrs. Brennan nearly fainted from shock. It's a nicer room, warmer, the kind of place where conversation might actually happen instead of echoing into nothing across 15 feet of mahogany. You asked for this once. I told you we had standards to maintain. I was an idiot. 3 weeks, 4, 5. No response. Rowan threw himself into estate work during the day and wrote letters at night that he wasn't sure anyone was reading. The tenants noticed something had changed in him. He was less rigid in his decision-making, more willing to hear alternate suggestions. Still competent, still running things efficiently, but different somehow. You all right, my lord? Young Tom Mitchell asked after Rowan actually laughed at something, a joke about a stubborn plow horse that wouldn't have registered as humorous 6 weeks ago. I'm not sure, Rowan admitted, but I think I might be better than all right used to be. 6 weeks after his first letter, a response finally came. Rowan's hands actually shook when Mrs. Brennan brought it to him. Plain envelope. Lydia's precise handwriting. He opened it in his study with the door closed, like the words inside might be too fragile for witnesses. Rowan, I've read all your letters. I wasn't going to respond. Told myself I wouldn't, that giving you even that much would be a mistake. But your last one made me cry, and I'm not sure if that's good or terrible. You're trying. I can see that. Whether you're succeeding is harder to judge from a distance. Catherine thinks I'm being too soft letting you write at all. She says you'll revert the moment I'm back in your reach, that people like you don't actually change. Maybe she's right, but there's a part of me, the stupid, hopeful part that married you in the first place, that wants to believe you're different than you were. So I'm responding. Once. Don't take it as permission to expect more. I'm painting again. Thought you should know that. Catherine set up a small studio in their attic, and I spend hours up there just creating, remembering what it feels like to make something beautiful instead of just enduring beautiful things made by others. It's the first time I've felt like myself in almost a year. That should tell you something about what our marriage did to me. L. Rowan read the letter 4 times. The mix of hope and hurt in her words made his chest ache. She was painting, finding herself again, becoming whole in a way she never could at Black Ridge. Part of him wanted to demand she come back immediately, that they could figure this out together. The old Rowan would have done exactly that, seen her recovery as proof the separation had gone on long enough, that now she was ready to resume their adequate marriage. The new Rowan, the one trying desperately to be better, understood that her healing had nothing to do with him, that she was growing despite their marriage, not because it was paused. He wrote back the same day, Lydia, I'm glad you're painting. You should be doing that. You should have always been doing that. I know what our marriage did to you. I watched it happen in real time and told myself it was fine, that we were fine, that adequate was good enough. I was watching you drown and calling it swimming. Don't come back because I'm writing pretty words. Don't come back until you're sure, absolutely certain, that you want to. And maybe don't come back at all if that's what you need to keep being yourself. I'll keep writing either way. Not because I expect anything from you, just because I think I owe you the truth of who I actually am underneath all the walls, still figuring out what that looks like. R. The letters became a rhythm, once a week from him, once every 2 or 3 weeks from her, stilted at first, then gradually more natural, like two strangers learning to communicate without the weight of failed expectations crushing every word. Lydia wrote about her painting, the frustration of relearning techniques she'd abandoned, the joy of creating something purely for herself. She wrote about Catherine's children, about the slower pace of Ashford life, about books she was reading and thoughts she was having. She sounded alive, present, like someone who'd been holding her breath for months and finally remembered how to exhale. Rowan wrote about the estate, but differently than he would have before. Not reports and statistics, stories about the tenants, observations about the land, admissions of mistakes he was trying to correct. He told her about conversations with Thorne, about Mrs. Brennan's pointed comments when he fell back into old patterns, about his attempts to be a better landlord and employer and human being. He didn't always succeed. Old habits were persistent, and control had been his primary language for so long that learning new vocabulary felt impossible sometimes. 3 months into their letter exchange, Rowan made a decision that would have been unthinkable before Lydia left. He hired a steward. James Morrison was young, barely 30, but came highly recommended. More importantly, he was competent enough to manage the day-to-day operations that Rowan had convinced himself only he could handle. "You're delegating," Thorne said when Rowan announced the hire. "I'm shocked you know how." "I'm learning that maybe being indispensable was just another form of control." Took you long enough to figure that out. With Morrison handling routine estate business, Rowan found himself with something he'd never had before. Time. Time to think. Time to read. Time to actually walk his own lands without it being a tactical inspection tour. Time to become someone other than Lord of Black Ridge. He wrote to Lydia about it. "I went to the North Ridge today. The one you mentioned months ago, the one I told you was too dangerous. It's not, by the way. At least not if you're paying attention to where you step. The view is extraordinary. You were right about that. I could see the McTavish holdings, and beyond that, the valley where the river cuts through. The kind of vista that makes you understand why people paint landscapes. I stayed up there for 2 hours, just sitting, thinking about how much I've missed by always moving, always working, always controlling. I think I understand now why you left. Not just the emotional isolation, though that would have been enough, but the suffocation of living with someone who couldn't sit still long enough to actually exist, who mistook constant motion for purpose. I'm trying to learn the difference." Her response came faster than usual. "Rowan, I'm glad you went to the ridge. I'm glad you're learning to be still. But I need you to understand something. These letters, they're good. You're being honest in ways you never were when we lived together. But letters are easy. You have time to compose your thoughts, edit out the parts that make you look bad, present yourself exactly as you want to be seen. Real life isn't like that. Real life is messy and immediate, and you don't get to revise your words before they land. I don't know how to trust that the person writing these letters is the same person who couldn't look at me over dinner, who scheduled intimacy like a business meeting, who made me feel like an inconvenience in my own marriage. I want to believe you've changed, but wanting and trusting are different things." L. The truth of it stung. She was right. Letters were safe. Controlled. He could write and rewrite until every word reflected exactly who he wanted to be. Living that person was harder. 4 months in, Lydia sent a letter that changed everything. "Rowan, I'm coming back to Blackridge. Not permanently, just for a visit. Catherine thinks I'm insane. Maybe I am. But I need to see if the man in these letters actually exists, or if I'm just reading hope into words written by someone who's good at saying the right things. I'll arrive on the 15th. I'll stay 3 days. After that, I'll decide whether there's anything worth saving in this marriage, or if we need to formalize the separation. Don't prepare. Don't plan some elaborate welcome. I don't want the Lord of Blackridge greeting me with proper protocols. I want to see who you actually are now, if that person exists." L. The 15th was 2 weeks away. Rowan's first instinct was to panic, to start planning, to organize every detail of her visit to showcase his improvements, to control the situation so thoroughly that she'd have no choice but to see how much he'd changed. Then he stopped himself. That was exactly what the old Rowan would have done. Turn her visit into a performance, prove change through careful staging rather than authentic being. He did nothing special to prepare, kept the estate running normally, didn't warn the staff to be on their best behavior, Didn't clean out her old chambers or arrange flowers or any of the theatrical gestures that would have made her arrival feel like a state occasion. He just waited and tried to be the person he'd been describing in his letters. The morning of the 15th, Rowan was in the north pasture helping Tom Mitchell repair a fence line when he saw the carriage approaching Black Ridge. His hands were dirty. His shirt was sweat-stained from physical labor. He looked nothing like the proper lord who'd watched her arrive 9 months ago, rigid and controlled and utterly disconnected. Morrison appeared at his elbow. "Sir, your wife is arriving. Shouldn't you—" "She'll wait 5 minutes while I finish this section." Rowan drove another post into the ground. "Tom, hand me the wire." By the time he made it back to the courtyard, Lydia was already standing beside the carriage, travel bag in hand, staring up at the stone walls of Black Ridge like she was facing down a dragon. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, cut in a style that framed her face differently. She wore a dress he'd never seen, practical traveling clothes, but with artistic touches, embroidery around the collar that was probably her own work. She looked older, steadier, like someone who'd survived something and come out stronger for it. She spotted him and went very still. Rowan approached slowly, aware of how he must look. Dirty, disheveled, completely unprepared for her arrival. "Lydia," he said. "Rowan." Her voice was carefully neutral. "You're working?" "Fence needed repair. Morrison could have handled it, but I was out there anyway." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe. "You hired a steward?" 3 months ago. Probably should have done it years ago, but I was too convinced only I could manage things properly. "And now?" "Now I think I was just scared of what I'd find if I stopped being indispensable to the estate." He gestured toward the house. "Would you like to come inside? Or would you prefer to stand in the courtyard analyzing me first?" The ghost of a smile crossed her face. "I've been analyzing you for 4 months via letters. I'm not sure 3 more minutes in a courtyard will reveal anything new." They walked into Black Ridge together, and Rowan was acutely aware of how the space must feel to her. Still stone. Still cold. Still the fortress she'd escaped. But small things had changed. Fresh flowers in the morning room. Not because he'd known she was coming, but because Mrs. Brennan had started adding them weeks ago. Books left open on tables instead of precisely shelved. Windows open to let in spring air instead of sealed against the elements. Tiny shifts, barely noticeable, but shifts nonetheless. "Your chambers are as you left them," Rowan said. "If you prefer different accommodations, I can—" "Those are fine." Awkward silence settled between them. 4 months of letters, and suddenly neither of them knew what to say face to face. "I should clean up," Rowan said finally. "Join me for lunch? If you'd like. In the breakfast room, not the formal dining hall." "All right." An hour later, they sat across from each other at the small table where Lydia had once asked to share meals. Rowan had washed and changed, but he'd deliberately not dressed formally. Just clean clothes, just himself. Mrs. Brennan served them personally, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp, watching their interaction like a hawk. "The letters," Lydia said after several minutes of eating in silence. "Were they true?" "Yes." "All of them?" "Every word." "Then why—" She set down her fork with more force than necessary. "Why couldn't you be that person when I was here? Why did it take me leaving for you to suddenly discover vulnerability? Because I'm a coward." The words came easier than they should have. "Because I spent my whole life afraid of turning into my mother, loving someone who couldn't love back, wasting away from that unrequited feeling. So I built walls so high that nothing could get in, including you, especially you." "That's not an answer, that's an excuse." "You're right. The answer is I didn't think I had to change. I thought our marriage was adequate, and adequate was good enough. I thought you'd eventually adjust to who I was instead of me having to become someone different." Lydia looked at him steadily. "And now?" "Now I know adequate was killing you. That watching you fade was exactly like watching my mother die, except I was the one doing it to you, and that realization—" His voice cracked. "That realization was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. Because you lost control. Because I lost you." The distinction mattered. Rowan could see it register in the way Lydia's expression shifted, softened slightly. "These 3 days," she said carefully, "what are you expecting from them?" "Nothing. I'm expecting nothing. You said you wanted to see who I actually am, so I'm just going to be that. Whatever you decide afterward, I'll accept. Even if I decide to leave permanently? The question felt like a blade between his ribs. Even then. They finished lunch mostly in silence, but it was different than the silence of their previous months together. Less empty. More like two people existing in the same space without needing to fill it with meaningless words. Afterward, Lydia disappeared to her chambers. Rowan returned to estate business, trying to act normal while hyper-aware of her presence somewhere in the building. Dinner that night was less awkward. They talked about neutral things, the estate, the tenants, Ashford, Catherine's children. Surface conversation, but not hostile, not performing. Just two people who used to be married, trying to figure out if they could be anything to each other again. The second day, Lydia asked to tour the estate. Not a formal tour, just walking the grounds, seeing how things had changed or stayed the same. Rowan showed her the North Ridge, the new grain stores, the cottage where the beam had collapsed during the winter storm. "You really rode out in that blizzard to help?" she asked. "Of course. The Mitchells needed assistance. The old Rowan would have sent someone else." The old Rowan was an idiot who thought delegation meant weakness. They walked further and Lydia stopped at a small clearing overlooking the valley. "I used to come here," she said quietly. "When the house felt too suffocating, I'd sit right there." She pointed to a flat rock. "And imagine what my life might have been like if I'd made different choices." Rowan's throat tightened. "I'm sorry you had to escape your own home to breathe." "Are you? Or are you sorry you got caught being who you actually were?" The question was sharp, fair, both probably. "I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry I was too blind to see it happening. But I'm also sorry that it took losing you for me to wake up to who I'd become." Lydia sat on her rock, staring out at the valley. Rowan stayed standing, giving her space. "Do you know what the worst part was?" she said eventually. "It wasn't that you didn't love me. I went into this marriage knowing love wasn't guaranteed. It was that you didn't even seem to like me, didn't find me interesting enough to pay attention to. I was just there, background furniture in your perfectly organized life." "You were never furniture." "Wasn't I? Name one thing you knew about me before I left, one real thing." Rowan opened his mouth, closed it, searched his memory desperately. "You liked tea in the morning room." "Everyone likes tea somewhere, Rowan. That's not knowing me. That's observing basic patterns." She was right. He'd shared a home with her for 8 months and knew virtually nothing about who she actually was. "I can't change that," he said finally. "Can't go back and pay attention when I should have. But I'd like to know now, if you'll tell me." Lydia was quiet for a long time, then, "I'm afraid of horses. Always have been. Every time I rode with you, I was terrified, but I did it anyway because I thought maybe shared activities would help us connect." Rowan felt like he'd been punched. "Why didn't you say anything?" "When? During our extensive conversations?" The bitterness in her voice was earned. "You never asked how I felt about anything. You just assumed I was fine with whatever you decided. I'm asking now. Now is 9 months too late." She stood, brushed off her skirt. "I want to see the library." They walked back in silence. In the library, Lydia went straight to the poetry book, her mother-in-law's book, and pulled it from the shelf. "Did you know your mother wrote in the margins?" She opened to a page filled with small, precise handwriting. "Look, notes, reactions, whole conversations with the poets." Rowan moved closer. He'd never noticed the marginalia before, had seen the worn spine, assumed it had been read frequently, but never actually looked inside. His mother's handwriting filled the spaces between verses. Questions, arguments, moments of understanding. "She was lonely too," Lydia said softly. "You can see it in the way she writes, desperate for connection, for someone to understand what these words meant to her." "I never knew." "Because you never looked. Just like you never looked at me." The accusation hung between them, irrefutable. "You're right," Rowan said, "about all of it. I was so busy maintaining the estate, upholding the legacy, being the perfect lord that I forgot to be a person, forgot to see other people as anything more than components in the machine I was running." "And you think 4 months of letters changed that?" "No. I think 4 months of letters let me start figuring out how much damage I'd done. The change, if there even is any, is still happening. I don't know if I'll ever be the person you needed me to be. Lydia replaced the book carefully. That's the first completely honest thing you've said since I arrived. Then I'll try to say more honest things and fewer pretty ones. That night at dinner, the conversation shifted. Stopped being careful and polite. Started being real. Tell me the truth, Lydia said over wine. If I hadn't left, would anything have changed? No. She blinked, clearly not expecting such direct honesty. No, Rowan repeated. I would have kept coasting, kept telling myself our marriage was adequate, kept watching you disappear and calling it adjustment. You leaving was the only thing catastrophic enough to crack through my delusions. So I had to destroy myself to get your attention. Yes, and that's unforgivable. I know that. Lydia set down her glass. Stop doing that. Doing what? Agreeing with me when I accuse you of terrible things. Fight back. Defend yourself. Give me something to push against instead of just accepting every criticism. Would fighting make it less true? No, but it would make you feel more real. This perfect acceptance feels like another performance. Rowan leaned back in his chair, studying her. You want me to fight? Fine. You're right that I was terrible. Right that I failed you in every way that mattered. But you know what? You let it happen for 8 months. Never once actually confronted me directly. Just kept trying gentle approaches and hoping I'd somehow intuitively understand what you needed. Lydia's eyes flashed. So this is my fault? No. But we're both people who avoided conflict, and that's part of how we ended up here. You resented in silence. I ignored in comfort. We were both too scared to actually fight for what we needed. I shouldn't have had to fight for basic recognition from my own husband. You're absolutely right. But I'm not a mind reader. I'm just a man who was raised to value control over connection, and I needed someone to tell me directly that wasn't working instead of hoping I'd figure it out. I tried. You hinted. You suggested. You never once looked me in the eye and said, Rowan, this marriage is killing me and something has to change. Until you left. And by then, the message was very clear. Lydia stood abruptly. So what? I'm supposed to apologize for not being better at communicating with someone who wouldn't listen anyway? No. You're supposed to acknowledge that we both failed here, just in different ways. The anger in her face was the most alive he'd seen her since she arrived. You want me to split the blame? After everything? I want you to stop treating me like I'm entirely villain, and you're entirely victim. We were two damaged people who had no idea how to be married, and we hurt each other. Your hurt was worse because I had more power in the dynamic, but neither of us was blameless. I hate that you're right. I hate that we're having this conversation 9 months too late. They stared at each other across the table, both breathing hard, the air crackling with tension that was actually honest for once. Lydia laughed suddenly, sharp, almost bitter. This is the most real conversation we've ever had. I know. We should have been fighting like this months ago. Yeah, we should have. She sat back down slowly. I don't know what to do with this. Neither do I. The letters made it seem simple, like you'd changed, I'd healed, maybe we could try again. But being here, she gestured at the room, the estate, everything. Being here reminds me how small I felt, how invisible. I know, and I can't promise that won't happen again. I can't promise I won't fall back into old patterns when stress hits or crisis demands attention. All I can promise is that I'll try, and that I'll listen when you tell me I'm failing. That's not enough. I know that too. The silence that followed felt different, heavier, like they'd finally reached the real question underneath everything else. Lydia stood again. I need to think. Alone. Of course. She left without another word. Rowan sat in the breakfast room long after she'd gone, staring at the space she'd occupied, wondering if he'd just destroyed whatever fragile chance he'd had by pushing back instead of accepting her anger with proper remorse. But the alternative, performing penitent husband while resenting the role, would have been another kind of dishonesty. If this failed, at least it would fail honestly. The third morning, Lydia didn't appear for breakfast. Rowan tried not to panic. Checked with Mrs. Brennan, who confirmed Lydia had taken tea in her room but hadn't left her chambers. By noon, he couldn't stand it anymore. He knocked on her door. Lydia? Silence. Lydia, If you want me to leave you alone, I will, but I need to know you're all right. More silence. Then, come in. She was sitting at the window, still in her nightgown, hair loose and messy. She looked exhausted. I didn't sleep, she said without preamble. Kept thinking about what you said, about how we both failed. Rowan stayed near the door, not wanting to crowd her. I shouldn't have pushed that hard. No, you should have. You were right. I did resent in silence. Did hope you'd magically understand without me having to risk actual conflict. She turned to face him. I'm angry about that. Angry at you for being oblivious. Angry at myself for being passive. Angry at this whole situation for being so impossibly broken. That's fair. Stop saying things are fair. Stop being so calm and accepting. I want to know what you're actually feeling. I'm terrified, Rowan admitted. Terrified that you're going to leave again, and this time I won't have the excuse of ignorance. That I'll know exactly what I'm losing, and lose it anyway, because I can't be what you need fast enough. That's better. More of that. I'm also angry. At myself mostly, for wasting 8 months. For being so convinced my way of living was right that I couldn't see it was slowly killing both of us. For, his voice broke. For having to lose you to finally understand what having you meant. Lydia's expression cracked. I don't know if I can trust you again. I know. I don't know if I even want to try. I know that too. But part of me, the stupid part that wrote back to your letters, wants to believe this is real. That you've actually changed. That maybe we could build something better than what we had. We couldn't build anything worse. The comment startled a laugh out of her. That's true. Rowan took a step closer. I'm not asking you to decide today, or even this week. I'm just asking you not to give up completely. Not yet. What would that look like? More letters? More visits? Maybe. Or maybe you stay. Not as my wife, not even in the same chambers. Just stay at Blackridge and let me prove day by day that I can be different. That we can be different. That's insane. Probably. But we tried marriage your way. Didn't work. Tried it my way. Catastrophic failure. Maybe we try something completely new. Lydia stood, moved to the center of the room. If I stayed, and that's a massive if, I'd have conditions. Name them. Separate chambers, completely separate. You don't visit unless explicitly invited. Done. I paint every day. That's not negotiable. I'll have a proper studio set up wherever you want it. And if I decide this isn't working, I leave. No arguments, no attempts to convince me otherwise. You let me go. That one hurt. But agreed. Lydia studied him for a long moment. This is probably a mistake. Almost certainly. We'll probably end up right back where we started. Maybe. Or maybe we'll end up somewhere completely different. She took a breath, held it, released it slowly. 1 month, she said. I'll stay 1 month. After that, we reassess. If it's not working, I'm gone permanently. 1 month, Rowan agreed. And Rowan? If you revert, if you go back to being that cold, distant lord who couldn't see past his own walls, I won't give you another chance. This is it. I understand. She nodded once, sharp and decisive. Then I need to send a letter to Catherine. Let her know I've apparently lost my mind. Rowan turned to leave, got to the door before her voice stopped him. Rowan? Yes? Thank you. For pushing back yesterday. For fighting with me instead of just accepting every accusation. That felt more real than months of careful politeness. I'll try to be more difficult then. Good. I've had enough of adequate. He left her there, sat in his study with shaking hands, and tried to process what had just happened. 1 month. 30 days to prove he could be someone worth staying for. 30 days before she made a final decision that would determine the rest of his life. Outside the window, storm clouds gathered over the highlands, and Rowan wondered if he was strong enough to survive what was coming, whether she stayed or went. But at least this time he'd be facing it with his eyes open. The storm hit that night with a vengeance. Rowan woke to thunder rattling the windows and rain hammering against stone like it was trying to break through. He lay in his bed, his own bed, in his own chambers, alone as he'd been for months, and listened to the violence of the weather matching the turbulence in his chest. 1 month, 30 days. He'd been granted a stay of execution and had no idea if he was capable of earning a pardon. Morning came gray and wet. Rowan found Lydia in the breakfast room, already dressed, staring out at the rain-soaked grounds. "Good morning," he said carefully. "Is it?" She didn't turn from the window. "Catherine's going to kill me when she gets my letter." "For staying?" "For being stupid enough to hope." Rowan poured himself coffee, joined her at the window. They stood side by side, not touching, watching water sheet down the glass. "I was thinking," he said after a moment, "about the studio, the old music room upstairs. It hasn't been used in years. North-facing windows, good light, if you want it. You're really going to let me paint? Not just tolerate it as a hobby? I'm really going to stay out of your way while you do what you love. There's a difference." Lydia glanced at him. "What are you going to do with all your free time now that you're not micromanaging every detail of the estate? Figure out who I am when I'm not Lord of Blackridge, I suppose. That terrifies you." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Rowan admitted. "I've been that role for so long, I'm not sure there's anything underneath it." "Then I guess we're both finding out who we actually are." She turned from the window. "Show me this music room." The space was dusty, filled with covered furniture and forgotten instruments, but the light was perfect, soft and even, streaming through tall windows that faced north over the valley. Lydia walked the perimeter slowly, her artist's eye cataloging possibilities. "The pianoforte could go," she said, gesturing to the massive instrument dominating one wall. "And those chairs, I'd need a proper easel, good storage for supplies, maybe a table for mixing colors. Consider it done. Just like that?" "Just like that. This is your space now, whatever you need." She looked at him with something that might have been suspicion or might have been hope. "Who are you, and what did you do with my husband?" "Still trying to figure that out myself." By afternoon, Rowan had enlisted Tom Mitchell and 2 other men to clear the room. The pianoforte proved surprisingly heavy, requiring careful maneuvering down narrow hallways. Halfway through the operation, Lydia appeared with tea and watched them struggle with obvious amusement. "You could hire professionals for this," she pointed out. "Could," Rowan grunted, wedging his shoulder against the instrument's bulk. "But then I'd miss the character-building experience of throwing out my back for my wife's art studio." "Ex-wife, technically. We're in some kind of probationary limbo." "Right, probationary limbo. Much better." Tom snorted a laugh, nearly losing his grip. "Careful, my lord. The lady might actually like you if you keep this up." "Shocking development," Lydia said, but she was smiling. It took 3 hours to clear and clean the room. By the time they finished, Rowan was filthy and exhausted and more satisfied than he'd felt in months. Physical labor, tangible results, creating something for someone else instead of maintaining systems. "Thank you," Lydia said quietly when the men had left. She stood in the center of the empty room, turning slowly. This is more than I expected." "It's a room. You needed a room. It's not about the room." She faced him. "It's about you spending an entire afternoon doing manual labor to give me something that matters to me." The old Rowan would have ordered it done and never touched it himself. The old Rowan was an idiot who thought delegation was leadership instead of just another form of distance. "You keep calling yourself an idiot." If the assessment fits, Lydia moved closer, close enough that Rowan could smell the soap she used, see the exact shade of blue in her eyes. "Here's what I need you to understand. I don't want grand gestures. I don't want you to flagellate yourself with guilt. I just want you to show up, consistently, as a real person instead of a title." "I'm trying." "I know, that's what scares me." She stepped back. "Because trying is easy. Sustaining is hard. And I don't know if you have the stamina for sustained change when you've spent your whole life being one way." "Neither do I," Rowan admitted. "But I'd rather fail trying to be better than succeed at staying the same." Pretty words again. "Then tell me what actions you want instead." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Eat dinner with me tonight. Actually, eat and talk, not just sit in proximity while reading reports." "Done." "And tomorrow I want you to tell me something true about yourself that you've never told anyone, something that makes you uncomfortable to share." That was harder. Rowan's entire life had been about control, and control meant keeping vulnerabilities hidden. But, all right? And stop agreeing so easily. Push back. Have opinions. Be difficult. You're asking me to be difficult while also being open and vulnerable? I'm asking you to be human. Humans are contradictory. Well, in that case, Rowan said, I think you're being unreasonable. Lydia's eyebrows rose. Excuse me. You want sustained change demonstrated immediately. You want consistency proven in 5 days. You want me to be perfectly balanced between agreeable and difficult, vulnerable and strong. That's not human. That's impossible. So what are you saying? I'm saying give me more credit for trying and less criticism for not being perfect at it yet. For a moment he thought she'd be angry. Then she laughed, actually laughed, bright and surprised. There you are, she said. That's the first time you've actually defended yourself instead of just absorbing everything I throw at you. You told me to be difficult. I did, didn't I? She shook her head. All right, point taken. I'll try to be less impossible. I didn't say impossible. I said unreasonable. Same thing. Not remotely. They stared at each other, and Rowan realized they were bantering. Actually bantering like two people who knew each other, who could challenge each other without it being an attack. When had that started? Dinner that night was different. They sat at the small table in the breakfast room, and Rowan deliberately left his papers in his study. No reports, no ledgers, just food and conversation. Tell me about the painting you're planning, he said. Lydia looked surprised. You want to hear about that? Unless you'd rather discuss grain yields. I'd rather eat glass than discuss grain yields. Then tell me about your art. She hesitated, like she was testing whether his interest was genuine. Then, I want to paint the highlands, not the way they're usually depicted, all romantic and sweeping. I want to capture the harshness, the way the wind cuts through everything, how the landscape feels more like a living thing than a backdrop. That sounds intense. It is. This place is intense. Living here is like being slowly shaped by erosion. You either become stone yourself or you break. Which are you? Still figuring that out. She took a sip of wine. What about you? If you weren't Lord of Blackridge, what would you want to be? The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that. His entire identity had been predetermined by birth. I don't know, he said finally. I've never let myself think about it. Think about it now. Rowan tried. Imagined a life without the estate, without the legacy, without 8 generations of expectations pressing down on him. Maybe something with my hands, he said slowly. Building things, fixing things. Today, working on your studio, that felt good in a way estate management never has. Creating something tangible instead of just maintaining systems. You could still do that. You have a steward now. I could. The possibility felt dangerous, radical. But then what would I be? What would be the point of me? Maybe the point of you isn't what you do for the estate. Maybe it's just you, as a person. The concept was so foreign, it made his head hurt. They talked late into the evening, about art and purpose and what it meant to be shaped by expectations you never chose, about Lydia's family, about Rowan's childhood, about the assumptions they'd both made about who they were supposed to be. When they finally parted for the night, Rowan felt exhausted in a good way. Like he'd actually connected instead of just performed proximity. Progress. Small, fragile, but real. The next morning, Lydia reminded him, something true you've never told anyone. Rowan had been dreading this, had lain awake trying to decide what vulnerability to offer, how much truth was enough without being too much. They were walking the grounds, the storm having cleared into a bright, cold morning. Frost clung to grass despite the late spring season, and their breath misted in the air. My father hit me, Rowan said abruptly. When I was young, not constantly, not in rage, but methodically, when I showed emotion or failed to meet his standards. He called it discipline, teaching me control. Lydia stopped walking. Rowan, you wanted something true. That's true. He'd make me stand in his study and recite estate management principles while he used a belt. If I cried, if I flinched, it started over. The lesson was that showing weakness only prolonged suffering. That's not discipline, that's abuse. Maybe, but it worked. I learned to control everything. Every reaction, every feeling became exactly what he wanted, a perfect heir who'd sacrifice anything for the estate. Including yourself, including everyone, especially myself. They stood in silence while Rowan tried not to feel like he'd just torn off his skin and handed it to her. Is that why you couldn't connect? Lydia asked quietly. Because connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain? Probably. I've never actually said that out loud before. Not even to yourself? Especially not to myself. Lydia reached out slowly, like approaching a spooked horse, and took his hand. The touch sent shockwaves through him. They'd barely touched since she'd returned, had been so careful to maintain distance. Thank you for telling me, she said. I know that wasn't easy. You asked for uncomfortable. That's the most uncomfortable thing I've got. Your father was wrong. Emotion isn't weakness. Connection isn't pain. He taught you to survive, but he never taught you to live. I'm starting to understand the difference. She squeezed his hand once, then released it. Come on, let's keep walking before I start feeling sympathetic, and we both know that's dangerous. Why dangerous? Because sympathy might lead to forgiveness, and I'm not ready to forgive you yet. Fair enough. But something had shifted. Rowan could feel it in the way Lydia looked at him now, not just seeing the Lord who'd failed her, but the damaged person underneath trying desperately to heal. The studio supplies arrived 3 days later. Rowan had written to art suppliers in Edinburgh, ordered everything Lydia might need: canvases, brushes, paints in every conceivable color, solvents, mediums, palette knives. When Lydia saw the delivery, she went very quiet. This is too much, she said. It's adequate. She turned to glare at him, caught the slight smile on his face. Did you just make a joke about adequate? Attempting humor. How am I doing? Terribly. But I appreciate the effort. She ran her hand over a box of pristine brushes. Seriously, Rowan, this must have cost… I don't care what it cost. You need proper tools. You have proper tools. End of discussion. Control issues showing? Probably. But in service of your happiness instead of my comfort. So I'm calling it progress. Lydia started setting up the studio that afternoon. Rowan helped carry supplies, then made himself scarce, recognizing that hovering would undermine the entire point of giving her independent space. He found himself at loose ends. For years, every hour had been scheduled, every moment filled with estate business. Now, with Morrison handling day-to-day operations and Lydia occupied with her art, he had time. The luxury of it was uncomfortable. He ended up in the library, pulling down his mother's poetry book. Read the marginalia carefully this time, seeing his mother's loneliness written in neat script beside verses about solitude and longing. This one understands she'd written next to a poem about loving someone unreachable, though I wish he didn't. Evidence that she'd known, had been aware of his father's emotional absence, and had suffered it consciously, deliberately, until it killed her. Rowan had spent his whole life determined not to be her, the one who loved without reciprocation, who wasted away from unrequited feeling. Instead, he'd become his father, the one who killed through absence. The realization sat in his chest like a stone. Find something interesting? He looked up to find Lydia in the doorway, paint already smudging her hands. My mother's notes. She was lonely, desperately lonely, and she knew it, which somehow makes it worse. Lydia came closer, looked at the marginalia. She was brave. Writing this down, acknowledging it, that takes courage. Or desperation. Maybe both. Lydia sat beside him. Do you remember her well? Not as well as I should. I was 12 when she died, old enough to remember, young enough that the memories are distorted by time and grief. What do you remember most clearly? Rowan thought. Her hands. She had artist's hands like you, always moving, always creating something. She did needlework, embroidery. The whole estate is full of her work, but I'd stopped seeing it. Show me. He led her through the house, pointing out his mother's creations. Tapestries, pillows, a massive wall hanging in the formal dining room, depicting the estate in different seasons. She made all this? Lydia breathed. Over years, yes. It was how she survived, I think, creating beauty in a place that felt cold. Like me with painting. Exactly like that. Rowan stopped in front of the dining room tapestry. I should have seen the parallel, should have understood that your art wasn't frivolous, it was survival. You see it now. Bit late though, isn't it? Better late than never. Lydia studied the tapestry. She was talented, Really talented. Yes. And no one ever told her that mattered, including me after she died. I just saw it as decoration. They stood together in the silent room, surrounded by a dead woman's desperate attempts to create meaning in a marriage that had none. I don't want to be her, Lydia said quietly. I don't want to spend decades creating beautiful things to fill the void where connection should be. You won't be, because I'm not him, or I'm trying desperately not to be. And if you fail, then you leave, like you should have done months ago, like your mother should have done. Yes, Lydia turned to face him. Why didn't she? Leave, I mean. She had family, resources. Why stay with someone who was killing her slowly? I don't know. Maybe she thought it would change. Maybe she was trapped by the same expectations we were, that marriage is forever, regardless of cost. Maybe she actually loved him, despite everything. That's the saddest possibility. I know. They walked back upstairs in contemplative silence. At the door to Lydia's chambers, she paused. Tomorrow I'm going to start painting, really painting. I'll be in the studio most of the day. Good. You're not going to ask to see the work? Not unless you want to show me. It's yours, private. I don't get access to everything just because we're married. Probationally married. Right, probationally married. Rowan smiled slightly. I'll be around if you need anything. Otherwise, I'll stay out of your way. You're getting better at this. At what? Respecting boundaries, giving space, being a person instead of a lord. High praise. Don't let it go to your head. But she was smiling when she closed the door. A week passed. Then 2. Rowan fell into a rhythm that felt foreign but not unpleasant. Morning walks around the estate. Conversations with Morrison about projects without micromanaging the details. Lunch, sometimes with Lydia, sometimes alone. Afternoons spent reading or helping with repairs or simply existing without the constant pressure of productive obligation. Evenings were for Lydia. Dinner together, conversation, the slow process of learning each other as actual people. They fought sometimes, real fights, not the careful disagreements of before. Lydia pushed back when Rowan fell into old patterns of control. Rowan called her out when she retreated instead of engaging. It was messy and uncomfortable and more honest than anything they'd experienced before. This is exhausting, Lydia said one night after a particularly heated argument about whether Rowan had any right to suggest improvements to the studio layout. Want to go back to polite silence? Absolutely not. But I reserve the right to complain about the work of actual communication. Noted. The turning point came 3 weeks into Lydia's month-long trial. She'd been painting for hours when Rowan heard a crash from the studio. He took the stairs 2 at a time, found her standing in the middle of the room, a canvas on the floor, paint everywhere. Are you hurt? No, just furious. She gestured at the fallen canvas. It's not working. Nothing's working. I can see what I want in my head, but I can't get it onto the canvas, and it's driving me insane. Can I see? It's garbage. Can I see the garbage? She waved permission. Rowan picked up the canvas carefully. It showed the highlands in storm, all violence and movement and raw power. It was aggressive, angry, absolutely breathtaking. This is incredible. It's terrible. The colors are wrong. The composition is off. The whole thing feels forced. Lydia, I don't know anything about art, but this makes me feel something. Isn't that the point? You're my husband. You have to say nice things. Probationary husband. And I've never said anything nice I didn't mean. You know that about me, if nothing else. She looked at him, at the canvas, back at him. You really think it's good? I think it's powerful. It makes me uncomfortable in the best way, like looking at something true that I'd rather not acknowledge. That's actually helpful criticism. Then I'll add art critic to my growing list of roles I'm unqualified for. Lydia laughed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Thank you for not trying to fix it or tell me what to do, just for seeing it. That's all I should have done from the beginning, just seen you. She moved closer, close enough that he could see paint in her hair, on her cheek. We're not fixed, you know. Even if this month goes well, we're not magically healed. I know. This is going to take years, if it works at all. I know that too. And you're willing to put in years of work for something that might still fail? Yes, because the alternative is giving up, and I've done enough of that already. Lydia studied his face like she was memorizing it. I'm starting to believe you might actually mean that. Progress? Terrifying progress. That night, for the first time since she'd returned, Lydia knocked on Rowan's chamber door after they'd said goodnight. He opened it to find her standing in the hallway in her nightgown, looking uncertain. I don't want to be alone tonight, she said. Not for that. Just, I don't want to be alone. Rowan stepped back, letting her in. They lay on opposite sides of his bed, not touching, just existing in the same space. Tell me something, Lydia said into the darkness. Did you ever actually want to marry me? Or was I just the adequate choice to fulfill an obligation? The question deserved honesty. I don't know. I was so focused on duty that I never let myself want anything. You were suitable. That was enough. That's depressing. Yes. But here's what I've figured out in the last few months. Suitable and adequate were just ways to avoid risk. If I never wanted anything, I could never be disappointed. If I never cared too much, I could never be hurt. How's that working out? Terribly. Turns out not caring hurts worse than caring and failing. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Then, I wanted to marry you. Not you specifically. I barely knew you. But I wanted marriage, partnership, the idea of building a life with someone. I was so naive. We both were, just in different ways. Can we be less naive now? We can try. They fell asleep like that, together but separate, connected but careful. Two people learning how to be in proximity without destroying each other. The next morning, Mrs. Brennan found them both at breakfast and actually smiled, her usually stern face transformed. It's good to see you both here, she said. We have breakfast together almost every day now, Rowan pointed out. Not that. Together. Actually together instead of just occupying the same room. After she left, Lydia said, Did Mrs. Brennan just give us her blessing? I think she did. The world really is changing. The final week of the trial period arrived faster than Rowan wanted. 7 more days before Lydia made her decision, stay or leave permanently. He tried not to count down, tried to just exist in each moment instead of catastrophizing about the future. It was harder than expected. On the 28th day, Rowan woke to find a note slipped under his door. Meet me at the North Ridge. Dawn. L. He dressed quickly, walked through the pre-dawn darkness to the overlook where Lydia had once come to escape her own home. She was already there, wrapped in a cloak, watching the sun rise over the valley. I've been thinking, she said when he joined her, about what it means to stay, what I'd be choosing. Rowan's heart hammered. And I'd be choosing to keep trying, to believe that people can change, that damage can heal, that two broken people might build something whole together. She turned to face him. But I'd also be choosing uncertainty, choosing to trust you when you haven't fully earned it yet, choosing hope over self-preservation. You don't have to choose hope. You can choose safety. I'd understand. Would you? Really? No, he admitted. I'd be devastated, but I'd understand. Lydia smiled slightly. At least you're honest now. It's all I have to offer. That's not true. You have this. She gestured at the estate, the valley, the sunrise painting everything gold. You have Blackridge. You have your legacy. You have nothing that matters without you. The words hung between them, raw and true. That's the first time you've said anything like that, Lydia said quietly. I've been trying not to pressure you, not to make your decision about what I want versus what you need. And if what I need is to hear that I matter more than the estate, then you matter more than the estate. More than the legacy, more than 8 generations of Hale expectations. You matter more than anything. Lydia's eyes were bright. How do I trust that? You probably can't, not yet. I've given you no reason to believe I'll maintain this when life gets hard or crises emerge or old patterns feel safer than new ones. Rowan took a breath. But I'm asking you to take a chance anyway. Not because I deserve it, because maybe we both deserve to find out who we could be together. That's not a small ask. I know. The sun crested the horizon fully, flooding the valley with light. Lydia turned back to watch it, and Rowan stood beside her, waiting for a verdict that would determine everything. Finally, she said, I'm staying. Relief hit him like a physical blow. You're Not permanently, not yet. But I'm staying past the month. I'm giving this more time. She looked at him steadily. On one condition. Anything. Stop treating me like a guest. Stop being so careful and proper. I want a real marriage or nothing. Mess and fights and actual partnership. No more probation. We're either doing this or we're not. We're doing this, Rowan said immediately. Even when I'm difficult? Especially then. Even when you fall back into old patterns and I call you on it? Yes. Even when it's hard and ugly and nothing like adequate? Especially then. Lydia stepped closer, close enough to touch. She raised her hand to his face, fingers gentle against his jaw. Then kiss me like you mean it, she said. Like I'm not an obligation to fulfill, but a person you actually want. Rowan pulled her close and kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning. Like she was light and he'd been in darkness. Like she was everything he'd never known he needed until he'd almost lost it forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lydia laughed, bright and surprised and alive. Well, she said, that was better than adequate. Give me time, I'll get even better. Confident. Hopeful. They stood on the ridge as the sun rose higher, two damaged people choosing to believe that broken things could be mended, that walls could come down, that adequate was never good enough when extraordinary was possible. The month had ended, but they were just beginning. Summer arrived at Blackridge like an unexpected guest, warm and insistent, transforming the harsh highlands into something almost gentle. Rowan and Lydia didn't magically become perfect together. They fought about stupid things, where to hang her paintings, whether the morning room needed new curtains, how much time he should spend with Morrison versus managing things himself. They disagreed about tenant policies and dinner menus, and whether it was acceptable for Rowan to reorganize her studio when she wasn't looking. I was trying to help, he protested after that particular disaster. I didn't ask for help. I asked for space. There's a difference. The paints were disorganized. They were organized by my system, which you would have known if you'd asked instead of assuming you knew better. Old Rowan would have dug in, would have defended his logic, explained why his way was more efficient. New Rowan, still learning, still stumbling, took a breath. You're right. I'm sorry. I'll put everything back exactly where it was. Damn right you will. But she helped him fix it, and afterward they laughed about his control issues resurfacing, and the fight became just another moment instead of a catastrophe. Progress wasn't linear. Some days Rowan fell back into old patterns, became curt and distant when stressed, retreated to his study instead of talking through problems. Lydia called him on it every single time. You're doing the thing, she'd say. What thing? The Lord of the Manor thing, where you make decisions without consulting me and expect me to just accept them. I wasn't... He'd catch himself. Actually, yes, I was. What did I do this time? They were learning each other's damage, mapping the scars, figuring out how to touch wounded places without causing more harm. It was exhausting and necessary and nothing like adequate. 6 weeks after Lydia's decision to stay, Catherine arrived unannounced. Rowan was in the courtyard when the carriage pulled up. Catherine emerged like an avenging angel, her expression promising violence. Where is she? Catherine demanded. Good afternoon to you too, Rowan said mildly. Lydia's in her studio. Would you like me to? I'd like you to explain why my cousin hasn't responded to my last 3 letters. Perhaps because she's been occupied with rebuilding her marriage? Or because you've isolated her again, and she's too ashamed to admit it. The accusation stung because it was exactly what the old Rowan would have done. She's painting, has her own studio, her own space, her own life. You're welcome to confirm that yourself. Catherine studied him with sharp eyes. You look different. I am different, or trying to be. Trying doesn't count for much if you fail. No, Rowan agreed, but it counts for more than not trying at all. Lydia appeared at that moment, paint-stained and smiling, and threw herself at Catherine with obvious joy. You're here! Why didn't you write? I would have prepared. Because you haven't answered my letters, and I was worried you were dead or imprisoned or brainwashed. I'm none of those things. Just busy and happy. Lydia glanced at Rowan. Mostly happy. Some days more than others. That's honest, at least. Catherine's eyes narrowed. Show me this studio I've heard nothing about. They disappeared into the house. Rowan waited in the courtyard, wondering if Catherine would emerge to stab him or if Lydia's reassurances would be enough. An hour later, Catherine found him in the library. "She's different," Catherine said without preamble. "Lighter. More herself than I've seen her in over a year." "Good. Don't get cocky. I'm still deciding whether to trust this. Join the club. I'm still deciding whether to trust myself." Catherine sat uninvited. "She showed me her paintings. They're remarkable, angry and beautiful and raw. She's talented. She always was. You just never bothered to notice." "I know. And now you notice because you almost lost her." "Yes." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "My husband thinks I'm too hard on you, says everyone deserves a second chance." He sounds wise. He's an optimist. I prefer evidence over hope. What evidence would convince you? Time? Consistency? Proof that this isn't just panic over losing something you took for granted. Catherine leaned forward. "Here's what I need you to understand. That girl loved you, actually loved you, despite everything. She came into this marriage wanting it to work, wanting to build something real, and you crushed that systematically." "I know." "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're a man who changed only when consequences became unavoidable. That's not growth. That's self-preservation." The assessment was brutal and possibly true. Rowan sat with it, turned it over, tested it for accuracy. "You might be right," he said finally. "Maybe I only changed because I was forced to. But here's the thing. I don't care what motivated the start. I care about what sustains it. And what sustains it now isn't fear of losing Lydia. It's actually knowing her, actually seeing who she is and wanting to be someone worthy of that." Pretty words. Then watch my actions instead. Stay as long as you want. See how we actually are together. If you don't like what you see, take her home with you when you leave. Catherine's eyebrows rose. "You'd let me do that?" "If it's what she needs, yes. I'd rather lose her to her own choice than keep her through manipulation or pressure." "Well," Catherine sat back, "that's either very enlightened or very stupid. Probably both." She stayed 3 days. Rowan could feel her watching them constantly, analyzing every interaction, every conversation, looking for cracks in the facade. But there was no facade to crack, just two people fumbling their way through actual partnership, making mistakes and correcting them, fighting and reconciling and trying to build something real from the wreckage of what they'd been. On Catherine's last night, Lydia hosted a dinner. Nothing formal, just the four of them in the breakfast room, the kind of casual gathering the old Blackridge would never have permitted. Catherine's husband, Marcus, was exactly as advertised. Optimistic, warm, the kind of person who saw the best in everyone. He asked Rowan about the estate with genuine interest, told terrible jokes that somehow still landed, made Lydia laugh until she couldn't breathe. Watching them, Rowan understood what he'd almost destroyed. This, connection, joy, the simple pleasure of shared company. He'd nearly sacrificed all of it for control and isolation and the cold comfort of adequacy. After dinner, Catherine pulled him aside. "I'm still watching you," she said. "One hint that you're reverting, one sign that Lydia's fading again, and I'm taking her back whether she agrees or not." "Understood. But," she paused, "I can see you're trying, and more importantly, I can see she's thriving. So keep doing whatever you're doing. Don't screw it up." "I'll do my best. Your best better be enough." They left the next morning. Lydia cried, saying goodbye, promised to write more regularly, made Catherine promise to visit again soon. When the carriage disappeared down the road, Rowan found Lydia still standing in the courtyard, looking pensive. "She doesn't trust me yet," he said. "Can you blame her? She watched me disappear for 8 months while I was married to you." "No, I can't blame her at all." Lydia turned to face him. "Do you know what she told me last night?" "That I'm on probation forever?" "That too, but also that she'd never seen me this happy. Not even before I married you. That whatever we're building now is better than anything we had before." "What did you say?" "That she's right, that this," Lydia gestured between them, "is scary and hard and uncertain. But it's real. And real is better than adequate ever was." Rowan pulled her close, held her tight, and tried not to think about how close he'd come to losing this forever. August brought the first real test. A grain blight hit 3 of the tenant farms. Not devastating, but serious enough to require immediate action and resources. The kind of crisis that would have consumed the old Rowan completely, turning him back into Lord of Blackridge, all business and efficiency and emotional distance. Lydia watched him shift into crisis mode at breakfast, saw the walls start reconstructing in real time. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't disappear into the estate and forget I exist. We've been here before. It didn't end well." Rowan stopped, coffee cup halfway to his mouth. She was right. This was exactly how he'd operated before. Let crisis justify isolation, used urgency as an excuse to disconnect. "I need to handle this," he said carefully. "I know, but handle it as someone who has a wife, not someone who's married to the estate." "What does that look like?" "I don't know. You tell me." He thought about it. The old response would be to disappear for days, manage everything himself, emerge exhausted and distant. The new response: "Come with me," he said. "What?" "Come with me to the affected farms. You wanted to be involved in estate business. Here's your chance." Lydia looked surprised. "You want me there?" "I want your perspective. I want someone to remind me that people matter more than yields. I want—" He smiled slightly. "I want you." They rode out together, spent the day assessing damage and talking with affected tenants. Lydia asked questions Rowan never would have thought to ask, about families, about stress, about how people were actually coping beyond just the economic impact. "Young Annie Mitchell is getting married next month," old Mrs. Brennan at the first farm told Lydia. "Been planning it for a year. Now with the blight, they're thinking they'll have to postpone." "Why?" Lydia asked. "Can't afford it, can they? Not with the lost income." After they left, Lydia turned to Rowan. "We should help with the wedding. We're already providing blight assistance. I mean, help make it happen. Annie's been looking forward to this. She shouldn't have to give it up because of circumstances beyond her control." The old Rowan would have refused, would have cited precedent, worried about setting unreasonable expectations, insisted on maintaining professional distance. New Rowan said, "What did you have in mind?" They spent the next week organizing. Lydia coordinated with the estate kitchens to provide food. Rowan arranged for the ceremony to be held on estate grounds, in the garden that had once been his mother's refuge. Mrs. Brennan contributed linens. Other tenants offered music and flowers and labor. The wedding took place on a perfect September afternoon, small, simple, and joyful in a way Blackridge had never seen before. Watching Annie Mitchell marry her sweetheart surrounded by community, Rowan felt something shift in his understanding of what the estate actually was. Not just land and legacy. Not just 8 generations of Hale management, but people. Living, loving, building lives that mattered more than any balance sheet. "This is what I wanted," Lydia said quietly, standing beside him as Annie and her new husband danced. "When I married you, I wanted to be part of something real, something that mattered. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. You're understanding now. That counts." That night, alone in their chambers, they'd been sharing a bedroom for a month now, the separate quarters abandoned as unnecessary. Lydia showed him something. "I finished it," she said, unveiling a large canvas. It showed Blackridge in storm and sunlight simultaneously, the fortress in shadow, but the valley beyond ablaze with light, hard and soft together, stone and sky, isolation and possibility. "It's us," Rowan said, understanding immediately. "It's what we were and what we're becoming. I wanted to capture both. The damage and the hope. It's perfect. It's honest. That's better than perfect." They hung it in the morning room, replacing a bland landscape that had occupied the space for generations. Looking at it became Rowan's morning ritual, a reminder of where they'd been and how far they had to go. October arrived cold and early. Lydia woke one morning feeling ill, barely made it to the basin before she was violently sick. Rowan held her hair, brought water, tried not to panic. "It's fine," she said weakly. "Probably just something I ate." But it continued. 3 days of morning sickness, exhaustion, sensitivity to smells. By the 4th day, Mrs. Brennan appeared with a knowing look. "Should I send for the doctor, my lady?" "I don't think I need a doctor to tell me what I already know," Lydia said quietly. Rowan's brain stuttered to a halt. "You're pregnant, probably. Unless there's another explanation for throwing up every morning and crying at nothing." He sat down heavily. A child. They were going to have a child. The thing that had been the entire point of their marriage originally, the duty he'd approached with mechanical efficiency, was now something entirely different. Terrifying. Real. Important. Say something, Lydia said. I don't know what to say. Try words, any words. I'm scared, Rowan admitted. I don't know how to be a father. My father was terrible at it, and I'm half convinced I'll be worse. Lydia moved to sit beside him. You're already better than him. You care enough to be scared. That's more than he ever managed. What if I fail? What if I can't? Then we'll fail together and try again and keep trying until we get it right. She took his hand. This is terrifying for me too, but we're in it together now. Actually together. Together, Rowan repeated. The word felt less like a promise and more like a lifeline. The pregnancy was not easy. Lydia was sick for months, exhausted constantly, uncomfortable and irritable, and nothing like the glowing, expectant mother paintings depicted. Rowan learned to bring her ginger tea, to not take her snappishness personally, to rub her back when she couldn't sleep. He also learned that terror could coexist with joy, that anticipation could be both wonderful and horrifying, that loving someone meant being vulnerable to 1,000 new kinds of fear. I'm huge, Lydia complained in her 7th month, staring at her reflection with obvious dismay. You're growing a human. You're allowed to be huge. You have to say that. You did this to me. Technically, we did it together. You had the fun part. I have the part where my body isn't my own and I can't see my feet. Rowan wrapped his arms around her from behind, hands on her swollen belly. For what it's worth, I think you're beautiful. You're delusional, possibly, but I'm your delusional husband, so you're stuck with me. She leaned back against him. I'm scared too. About the birth, about being a mother, about screwing up this tiny person before they even have a chance. Then we'll be scared together, and somehow that makes it less terrible. The baby came early on a freezing February night. Rowan paced the hallway while Lydia labored, listening to her scream and being absolutely useless. Mrs. Brennan threw him out twice for getting in the way. You want to help? She snapped. Stop hovering and let us work. He ended up in his study, staring at his father's old desk, thinking about legacy and what actually mattered. 8 generations of Hales had sat in this room, managing the estate, maintaining control, building a dynasty. And somehow they'd all missed the point. The point wasn't the estate. It was what you built within it. The lives you touched, the love you created, the chance to be better than the broken people who came before. My lord? Morrison appeared in the doorway. You have a daughter. Rowan's legs nearly gave out. Is Lydia? Exhausted but well. The baby's healthy. They're asking for you. He took the stairs at a run, burst into the bedroom to find Lydia propped against pillows, hair matted with sweat, looking more exhausted than he'd ever seen her, and in her arms a tiny bundle that was somehow their daughter. She's perfect, Lydia said, tears streaming down her face. She's absolutely perfect. Rowan moved closer on shaking legs. The baby was red and wrinkled and looked nothing like perfect. She looked like a tiny, angry potato. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Can I? His voice cracked. Can I hold her? Lydia transferred the baby carefully. The weight was nothing and everything simultaneously. This tiny person who was half him, half Lydia, entirely herself. Hello, he whispered. I'm your father. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I promise to try. Every single day, I'll try. The baby yawned, completely unimpressed. We need a name, Lydia said. They discussed this, had lists, had argued about family names versus new starts. Now, looking at his daughter, Rowan knew exactly what she should be called. Eleanor, he said, after my mother. Lydia's expression softened. Eleanor, I like it. Eleanor Hale. Eleanor Hale, Rowan repeated. May you be nothing like your grandfather and everything like your grandmother and absolutely yourself above all else. That's a lot of pressure for someone who's 30 minutes old. She can handle it. Look at her. She's already fierce. They sat together, mother, father, daughter, while morning light crept through the windows. Outside, Blackridge stood as it had for 8 generations. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a home. The first year of Eleanor's life was chaos. Sleepless nights, constant worry, the relentless demands of a tiny human who had opinions about everything. Rowan learned to change nappies, to pace the floor at 3 in the morning, singing terrible lullabies, to function on 2 hours of sleep. He also learned that he'd never loved anything the way he loved this small person, that terror could coexist with joy, that being vulnerable, to love, to fear, to all the ways parenthood could break you, was the only way to be truly alive. "You're good at this," Lydia said one night, watching him soothe Eleanor through another bout of colic. "I'm exhausted and terrified. That's not good. You're present. That's what matters." Eleanor turned 2, then 3. The estate continued running, but it was no longer Rowan's entire identity. He was a father first, a husband second, and Lord of Blackridge somewhere down the list after person who occasionally remembers to sleep. They had another child, then another. The old manor house filled with noise and chaos, and so much life it sometimes felt like the walls might burst. "This place was so quiet when I first arrived," Lydia said one afternoon, paint in her hair, a toddler on her hip, Eleanor and her brother fighting over something in the background. "I thought the silence would kill me. And now? Now I can't remember what silence sounds like." They were in the garden, the same garden where Lydia had once sat alone, imagining different choices. Now it was full of children's laughter, torn up flower beds from enthusiastic helping, and the general destruction that came with small humans. Rowan's mother's embroidery still hung throughout the house, but now it was joined by Lydia's paintings. The library held both poetry and children's books. The formal dining room was rarely used, replaced by chaotic family meals in the breakfast room. Blackridge had become something new, something better. 5 years after Lydia's return, Catherine visited again. Eleanor was 7 now, confident and opinionated, exactly like her mother. The twins, James and Ella, were 5 and into everything. "You've multiplied," Catherine observed dryly. 3 seemed like a good number, Lydia said. "Any more and we'd be outnumbered." Catherine watched Rowan chase the twins through the garden, both of them shrieking with laughter while he made monster noises. "That's the man you married?" she asked. "That's the man he became. I'll be honest. When you told me you were staying, I gave it 6 months before you came running back." "I know. I gave it about 3 months myself." "What changed?" Lydia thought about it. "He did. I did. We both decided that being broken wasn't an excuse to stay broken, that we could choose to be better even when it was hard, especially when it was hard." "That's disgustingly optimistic. I learned it from Marcus." Catherine smiled. "He'll be pleased. He always said Rowan just needed someone to believe he could change." "It wasn't belief. It was demand. I demanded better and refused to accept less. And he rose to meet it. Eventually, after I left, after we fought, after we both admitted we'd failed, then he rose to meet it." They watched Rowan collapse on the grass, twins climbing over him like he was a mountain to conquer. Eleanor joined in, all 3 children piling on while he pretended to be defeated. "He's happy," Catherine said, sounding surprised. "We both are. Not perfectly. Not every day. But more days than not. And when the bad days come, we remember what it cost to get here, and we fight for it." That night, after the children were finally asleep, Rowan found Lydia in her studio. She'd been working on a series of family portraits, not formal posed paintings, but captures of real moments. Eleanor reading, the twins building some elaborate destruction, Rowan and Lydia together, hands intertwined. "Catherine thinks we're a miracle," Lydia said, not looking up from her work. "We're not a miracle. We're just 2 people who refuse to give up." "Maybe that's the same thing." Rowan moved behind her, arms around her waist, chin on her shoulder. "Do you ever regret it? Staying? Giving me another chance?" "Sometimes," Lydia said honestly. "On the hard days when you fall back into old patterns and I have to remind you I'm not estate property. When being married to you feels like work instead of joy." "That's fair." But then I remember the alternative. Remember what it felt like to be invisible in my own marriage. And I know this, even the hard parts, is better than that ever was. I'm sorry I put you through that. I know, you've apologized 1,000 times. At some point, you have to stop apologizing and just keep being better. I'm trying. I know, that's why I stay. 10 years after their marriage, Blackridge hosted a festival. Not the formal tenant meetings of before, but an actual celebration. Food and music and dancing, the entire community gathered to mark the estate's anniversary. It was Lydia's idea. Rowan would never have thought of it, too focused on practical management to see the value in pure joy. But watching his children dance with tenant children, seeing Lydia laugh with the wives while the men argued good-naturedly about crops, Rowan understood what she'd been trying to create from the beginning. Community. Connection. The kind of life where people mattered more than systems. You did this, he told her as they watched the festivities. We did this. Together. I would have destroyed it without you. You would have maintained a perfectly adequate estate without me, and been miserable, and made everyone around you miserable. Same thing, she laughed. Not even close. They danced as the sun set, surrounded by people who knew their story, who'd watched Lord Hale transform from rigid master to actual human being, who'd seen Lady Lydia go from ghost to vibrant presence. Do you think they forgive me? Rowan asked quietly. The tenants, Mrs. Brennan. Everyone who watched me be terrible for years. I think they're too busy appreciating who you are now to worry about who you were then. I worry about it. I know. But you don't have to. The person you were isn't the person you are. Thanks to you. Thanks to both of us. I demanded better. You delivered it. We're a team. The festival lasted late into the night. Eleanor fell asleep on a blanket, twins curled against her. Rowan carried them back to the house one by one, tucked them into beds, kissed foreheads. This was what mattered, not legacy or duty or 8 generations of expectations, just love. Messy, imperfect, hard-won love. Eleanor grew into a brilliant, fierce young woman who wanted to study medicine. James became an engineer, fascinated by building things. Ella developed her mother's artistic talent, painting canvases that hung alongside Lydia's throughout the estate. None of them were groomed to be Lord or Lady of Blackridge. Rowan and Lydia had hired permanent stewards, transformed the estate into something that could function without being someone's entire identity. What will happen to it when we're gone? Rowan asked one evening. They were in their 60s now, hair gray, bodies slower, but still together. It'll keep running. Someone will manage it. Maybe one of the kids will want it, maybe not. Either way, Blackridge will survive. My father would be horrified. Your father was an abusive bastard who died alone and miserable. I'm not particularly concerned with his opinion. Rowan laughed. Even after decades, Lydia's bluntness could surprise him. What about my mother? He asked. What would she think? Lydia was quiet for a moment, considering. I think she'd be proud. You broke the cycle, built something better. That's all any parent can hope for. They were in the library. The same library where Rowan had first found evidence of his mother's loneliness written in poetry margins. Now the shelves held books from 3 generations, margins filled with different handwriting, different thoughts, evidence of lives actually lived instead of just endured. I wish I could tell her, Rowan said quietly, that it doesn't have to be this way. That choosing to love isn't weakness. That vulnerability is strength. You tell her every day, by living differently than she could. That's not enough. It's all we have. Rowan stood, pulled Lydia to her feet, held her close. Even now, decades into their marriage, touching her felt like coming home. Thank you, he said into her hair. For what? For leaving. For coming back. For demanding better. For not giving up when giving up would have been easier. You did the work, Rowan. I just held up a mirror. You did more than that. You saved me. We saved each other. They stood together in the library while night fell over Blackridge, 2 people who'd almost destroyed each other and instead had built something worth surviving for. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the children threw them a celebration. Eleanor flew in from Edinburgh where she practiced medicine. James came from London with his husband and adopted daughter. Ella arrived from Paris, where she'd been studying art. The Great Hall, rarely used for decades, was filled with people. Tenants and friends and family, everyone who'd watched the transformation of Blackridge from fortress to home. Catherine was there too, ancient now but still sharp-eyed. I never thought you'd make it this long, she told Rowan bluntly. Neither did I. But you did, against all odds and better judgment. Thanks to Lydia. Thanks to both of you being stubborn enough not to quit. Speeches were made, terrible jokes told. Someone dug up Rowan and Lydia's wedding portrait, both of them stiff and uncomfortable strangers forced together by duty. "Look at us," Lydia said, studying the painting. "We look miserable. We were miserable. We just didn't know it yet. And now?" Rowan looked around the hall, at their children, at the community they'd built, at Lydia herself, white-haired and wrinkled and more beautiful to him than the young woman in the portrait. "Now I know what happy actually looks like." They danced, slowly, carefully, bodies no longer as cooperative as they'd once been, but together, always together. "Do you think we did all right?" Lydia asked. "In the end, we did better than all right. We built something real, even though it almost killed us first. Especially because of that. The breaking was necessary. We couldn't build something new until we destroyed what wasn't working. Philosophy from Lord Hale. Who knew you had it in you? I contain multitudes. Also, my back hurts. Can we sit down?" They sat, watched their children and grandchildren dance, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived. "I'd do it again," Rowan said suddenly. "Do what?" "All of it. The failures, the fighting, the years of being terrible. If it meant ending up here with you, with this life we built, I'd do every mistake again." Lydia took his hand, laced their fingers together. "I wouldn't. I'd skip straight to the good parts. Where's the drama in that? I've had enough drama for several lifetimes, thank you." "Fair point." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind only decades together could create, the kind Rowan had once thought was adequate, before he learned the difference between quiet acceptance and actual peace. Outside the windows, stars emerged over the highlands. Blackridge stood solid and eternal, witness to generations of Hales making the same mistakes over and over, until Rowan and Lydia had chosen differently, had chosen to break the pattern, to build something better, to prove that damage wasn't destiny. "I love you," Rowan said. Simple words he'd been afraid to speak for so long. "I know," Lydia replied. "I love you too, even when you're difficult. Especially when I'm difficult." "Don't push it." They laughed together, hands intertwined, surrounded by the life they'd almost destroyed and then fought to rebuild. The fortress had become a home. The adequate had become extraordinary. And two broken people had proven that sometimes everything has to shatter before something real can survive. Years later, long after both had passed, their great-granddaughter would find Lydia's journals in the attic, would read the story of two people who'd failed spectacularly and loved imperfectly and built something worth remembering. She'd read Rowan's early letters, stiff and formal and desperately trying to communicate across a chasm of his own creation. Would read Lydia's responses, hurt and hope mixed together, refusing to settle for adequate. And she'd understand that love wasn't a fairy tale. It was work and choice and fighting for each other even when fighting felt impossible. But in Blackridge's halls, Lydia's paintings still hung alongside Eleanor Hale's embroidery. 3 generations of women who'd survived fortress walls and built beauty anyway. And if you looked closely at the morning room painting, the one showing Blackridge in storm and sunlight, you could see 2 figures in the valley beyond the estate, walking together. Not perfect, not adequate, just real. And real, it turned out, was always enough.